No one noticed she was missing at first, and that silence would end up meaning everything. Thursday morning in Boronia, Victoria. June 2nd, 2011. The kind of morning where nothing seems unusual, where everything feels the same as yesterday and the day before that. Frost on windshields. School uniforms pressed. Breakfast routines playing out in 1,000 homes across the suburb, each one identical to the last. In a modest brick house on Elsie Street, a 13-year-old girl ate her breakfast. Toast, probably. Maybe cereal. The kind of detail that shouldn't matter, except that later, people would try to remember everything about that morning. They'd replay it over and over, searching for something they missed. Her name was Bung Siriboon. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoy true crime stories like this, make sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Bung wasn't the kind of child who drew attention to herself. Not in a bad way. She was quiet, thoughtful, the type of student who sat near the front of the class, not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because she genuinely wanted to learn. Mathematics fascinated her. So did music. She'd spend hours practicing piano, her fingers moving across keys with a precision that surprised people who knew how recent her arrival in Australia had been. She'd been born in Thailand, raised there for the first years of her life in a culture that valued politeness, respect, family above all else. When her mother, Vanita, remarried and moved the family to Melbourne, Bung adapted. Not easily. Moving countries never is, but she tried. She learned English, though it didn't come naturally. She made friends, though the cultural differences sometimes left her feeling like she was translating more than just words. Her stepfather, Fred, was Australian. A truck driver. Solid, dependable, the kind of man who showed love through providing rather than saying. He worked long hours, but he was there, present. The family was small: Bung, her mother, her younger sister Pang, and Fred. They lived simply. They were, by all accounts, normal. Whatever normal means. Because there's something we tell ourselves about normal. We use it as armor. As long as things are normal, as long as the routines continue, as long as Thursday morning looks like Wednesday morning, we're safe. The world makes sense. Bad things happen to other people, in other places, in situations that were somehow asking for it. Bung's life was normal, right up until the moment it wasn't. That Thursday morning, she left the house at 8:20 a.m. This was her routine. She was in year 8, at St. Joseph's College, a Catholic school about 1.5 kilometers from home. Not a long walk. Maybe 20 minutes at a steady pace. 15 if you hurried. Bung usually walked alone. Not because she didn't have friends, she did. Not because she was isolated, she wasn't. It was just logistics. Timing. The randomness of suburban life where everyone lives close, but not quite close enough to coordinate morning routines. So she walked. And her mother let her, because 13 is old enough, because the streets were familiar, because this was Boronia, not some dangerous city center. Because it was normal. The morning was cold. Bung wore her school uniform, a navy skirt, white shirt, the maroon sweater with the school crest. Her backpack was filled with the usual things. Books, pencils, homework she'd completed the night before, because Bung always completed her homework. Her phone was at home, charging on her bedside table. She didn't take it with her that morning. This detail would matter later. It would matter so much that police would mention it repeatedly, that journalists would circle back to it, that her mother would cry about it. Because in 2011, even 13-year-olds carried phones. Not all of them, but enough. And Bung had one. She just didn't bring it. Why? No one knows. Maybe the battery was dead. Maybe she forgot. Maybe she didn't think she'd need it for a 15-minute walk to school. At 8:20 a.m., she walked out the front door of the house on Elsie Street. Her mother saw her leave. This would be the last time Vanita saw her daughter. 2 houses down, a neighbor was outside. They saw Bung pass. They'd see her most mornings, though they rarely spoke. Just a polite nod, maybe a smile. The neighbor would later tell police that Bung looked completely normal that morning. Not distressed. Not hurried. Just a teenage girl walking to school. The route from Elsie Street to St. Joseph's College is simple. You head down to Harcourt Road, follow it northeast, and the school appears on your left. The rear entrance, the one students typically used, faced Harcourt Road directly. You couldn't miss it. Bung knew this route like she knew her own heartbeat. At 8:55 a.m., Someone else saw her. Another witness. This sighting was further along Harcourt Road, closer to the school. Much closer. By this point, Bung was approximately 130 meters from the rear gate of St. Joseph's College. 130 meters. Less than half the length of a standard running track. The kind of distance you could cover in under 2 minutes at a casual walk. Probably less than a minute if you were hurrying, if you'd realized the time and needed to get to class before the bell rang. This was the last confirmed sighting of Bung Siriboon. 130 meters from school. 130 meters from safety. From teachers and classrooms and the structured predictability of a Thursday morning. From witnesses and security and the simple presence of other people. She never arrived. And here's the thing that makes this so disturbing. The detail that would haunt investigators for years. That final stretch of Harcourt Road wasn't deserted. It wasn't some isolated rural road or dark alley. This was a suburban street on a school morning. There were houses. There were cars. There should have been other students, other parents, dog walkers, commuters. Someone should have seen something. But if they did, they either didn't realize what they were seeing, or they never came forward. The morning continued. First period started. Attendance was taken. In one classroom, a teacher marked Bung Siriboon as absent. This wasn't unusual. Kids got sick. Parents kept them home. Sometimes students skipped class, though Bung wasn't the type. The teacher assumed she was ill. No one called home to check. This wasn't policy for a single absence. If a student missed multiple days, sure, the school would reach out. But one day, one morning, they'd wait. They'd assume it was normal. Second period came and went. Bung's empty desk remained empty. Her friends noticed, of course they noticed, but they didn't raise alarms. They figured the same thing everyone else figured. Bung was sick. She'd be back tomorrow. Or Monday. Lunch came. Then afternoon classes. At St. Joseph's College, teachers taught their lessons. Students ate their lunches. The day unfolded exactly as it was supposed to. The machinery of routine continued turning, oblivious to the fact that one girl who should have been there wasn't. Meanwhile, at the house on Elsie Street, Vanita went about her day. She had no reason to worry. She'd seen Bung leave for school. Everything had been fine. Normal. 3:30 p.m. arrived. School ended. Students poured out of classrooms, headed for buses and cars, and the walk home. The afternoon routine, mirror image of the morning. Vanita expected Bung to walk through the door around 4 p.m. Maybe a little earlier. Maybe a little later. There was always some variance. A friend to chat with. A teacher to ask a question. The rhythm of a teenager's schedule. 4 p.m. came. Bung didn't. 4:15. 4:30. This was when the first real twinge of concern started. Not panic, not yet. Just that subtle discomfort when something is slightly off. When routine breaks pattern. At 4 p.m., Vanita called one of Bung's friends. The conversation was brief. Casual at first. Is Bung with you? No. Did you see her after school? No. We didn't see her at school at all today. Pause. She didn't come to school? No. We thought she was sick. That's when everything changed. That's when the word normal stopped applying. Because suddenly Vanita was looking at a timeline that didn't make sense. Bung left the house at 8:20 a.m. She should have arrived at school by 8:40, maybe 8:45 at the latest. School started at 9. But she never arrived. Which meant for the last 8 hours, no one had known where Bung Siriboon was. Vanita called Fred. They converged on the school. Maybe there was a mistake. Maybe Bung had been there, but left early. Maybe she'd felt sick and walked home a different route and was waiting at the house right now, wondering where everyone was. They checked. She wasn't. They searched the school grounds. They asked teachers. They checked with the office. Had anyone seen Bung Siriboon today? No. The administrative staff pulled attendance records. Confirmed, marked absent, all day. But she left for school. Her mother saw her leave. By early evening, police were called. This is where the story shifts. Where personal worry becomes official investigation. Where a missing child stops being a family's private crisis and becomes a matter of public record. The initial response was measured. Police asked the standard questions. When was she last seen? What was she wearing? Did she have her phone? Any problems at home? Any reason she might run away? No. 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 Bung wasn't the type to run away. She had no history of it. No behavioral issues. No fights with her parents. No secret boyfriend or troubling friend group. She was, by every account, a responsible, cautious teenager who followed rules and respected authority. So where was she? The first searches began that night. Officers walked the route from Elsie Street to St. Joseph's College, flashlights cutting through the darkness. They looked for any sign, a dropped backpack, a discarded shoe, anything that might tell them what happened in those missing minutes between 8:55 a.m. and 9 a.m. They found nothing. The next morning, the search intensified. This wasn't a teenager who'd stayed out late at a friend's house. This wasn't a misunderstanding. 24 hours had passed. Bung Siriboon had been missing for an entire day. Police established a timeline. They interviewed witnesses. The neighbor who'd seen Bung 2 houses from home. The person who'd spotted her on Harcourt Road at 8:55. They tried to find anyone else who'd been in the area that Thursday morning. They knocked on doors. More than 1,000 of them, eventually. They asked residents if they'd seen anything unusual. A girl matching Bung's description. A car that seemed out of place. An interaction that looked wrong. Most people had seen nothing. Some remembered a girl in a school uniform. But there were lots of girls in school uniforms that morning. Nothing specific. Nothing that helped. The homicide squad took over quickly. This might seem premature. Bung had only been missing for a couple of days. But investigators recognized something in the pattern of this disappearance. The complete lack of evidence. The narrow window of time. The absence of any logical explanation. This wasn't a runaway. This was something else. They reviewed CCTV footage from nearby businesses and homes, though coverage in suburban Boronia was sparse. They checked traffic cameras. They analyzed cell tower data, even though Bung's phone had been at home. Everything led nowhere. By the end of the first week, search teams had combed through bushland surrounding the area. Parks, creeks, any place a person, or a body, might be hidden. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters flew overhead. Volunteers joined professional searchers, walking shoulder to shoulder through dense brush. They found nothing. Bung's face appeared on the news. Local at first, then national. The story had all the elements that capture public attention. A young girl, a mysterious vanishing, a family desperate for answers. Journalists descended on Boronia. Camera crews filmed the route from Elsie Street to the school. Reporters interviewed neighbors, classmates, anyone who'd known Bung. Everyone said the same thing. She was a good kid. Quiet. Smart. This didn't make sense. The police held press conferences. They appealed for information. They set up a dedicated tip line. Calls came in. Dozens, then hundreds. Most were well-meaning, but useless. Some thought they'd seen a girl matching Bung's description in a shopping center 30 kilometers away. Others reported suspicious vehicles they'd noticed weeks earlier. A few were clearly disturbed individuals inserting themselves into the investigation. Every lead was followed. Every tip investigated. None of them brought Bung home. Behind the scenes, detectives were building a theory. They didn't share it publicly. Not yet. But among themselves, a consensus was forming. Bung Siriboon had been abducted. It was the only explanation that fit. She hadn't run away. There was no evidence of planning, no money taken, no clothes missing. She hadn't had an accident. No body had been found, no signs of injury along her route. She hadn't simply gotten lost. Boronia wasn't that big, and Bung knew the area. Someone had taken her. But who? And how? That 130-meter stretch of road became an obsession. Investigators walked it repeatedly, trying to understand how someone could have grabbed a teenage girl in broad daylight on a school morning without anyone noticing. The timing would have been incredibly tight. Between 8:55 a.m., when Bung was last seen, and 9 a.m., when school started, someone would have had to approach her, force her into a vehicle, or otherwise move her and disappear. All without attracting attention. All without leaving physical evidence. It should have been impossible. But Bung was gone. Detectives considered every scenario. Had someone been watching her? Following her routine? Maybe someone who knew she walked to school alone, who'd identified that vulnerable 15-minute window when she was isolated. They looked at registered sex offenders in the area. Interviewed them. Checked alibis. Some didn't have solid ones, but none had evidence linking them to Bung's disappearance. They investigated people closer to home. Friends of the family. Acquaintances. Anyone who'd had contact with Bung. This is standard procedure, though it wounded her family deeply. The implication that someone they knew, someone they trusted, might have hurt their daughter. Every person checked out. Or at least, none of them raised enough suspicion to warrant arrest. Weeks turned into months. The intensive daily searches wound down. The media moved on to other stories. The tip line rang less frequently. But the investigation never stopped. Because something else had happened. Something that made investigators believe Bung's disappearance wasn't random, wasn't isolated. Just weeks after Bung vanished, another incident occurred. A 16-year-old girl was walking in a nearby area when a man in a vehicle approached her. He tried to get her into the car. She refused. She ran. She escaped. When police investigated, they found similarities. The location, the method, the target, a young girl walking alone. Was it connected? They couldn't prove it. The 16-year-old couldn't provide a detailed description of the man or the vehicle. It had happened so fast. She'd been too frightened, too focused on getting away. But the timing was suspicious. Too suspicious to ignore. And then there was something else. Something darker. A historical echo that made everyone involved in the case deeply uncomfortable. Bung's disappearance reminded some investigators of another case. One that had haunted Melbourne for decades. Carmine Chan. In 1991, 13-year-old Carmine had been abducted from her home in Templestowe. She'd been taken by a man who became known as Mr. Cruel, a serial predator who'd broken into homes, attacked young girls, and somehow evaded capture despite a massive investigation. Carmine's body was found a year later. She'd been shot. Mr. Cruel was never caught. The case remains unsolved. Now, 20 years later, another 13-year-old girl had vanished from a Melbourne suburb. The circumstances were different. Bung had been taken from the street, not her home, but the age, the location, the complete lack of evidence. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Was Mr. Cruel still active? Or was this someone new? Someone inspired by those earlier crimes? Or was this just a terrible coincidence? The universe's cruel way of reminding Melbourne that monsters don't always get caught? No one knew. What they did know was that a child was missing. And with each passing day, the likelihood of finding her alive diminished. Vanita held on to hope. She had to. What else could a mother do? She gave interviews, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. She described Bung's personality, her dreams, her habits. She made her daughter real for the public, hoping that reality would translate into action. Fred stood beside her, quieter but equally determined. He'd driven his truck routes searching for any sign of Bung, any indication of where she might be. He'd stare at roadside ditches and wooded areas, his mind going to places no parent should have to go. Pang, Bung's younger sister, tried to understand. How do you explain to a child that their sibling might never come home? How do you maintain normalcy when nothing is normal anymore? The house on Elsie Street became a shrine of sorts. Bung's room remained untouched. Her bedmate. Her schoolwork on her desk. The phone that should have been in her pocket that morning still on the charger. Birthdays passed. Bung turned 14, 15, 16. Each year, Vanita would mark the occasion privately, painfully. Each year, she'd wonder where her daughter was. If she was alive. If she was suffering. If she was. But you can't think like that. You can't go there. So you hope. You wait. You pray to whatever God might listen. The investigation continued, but it became colder. Not in terms of police dedication. The homicide squad never officially closed the case, but in terms of leads. New information stopped coming in. The trail went completely cold. Detectives still believed Bung had been abducted. They still believed someone out there knew what happened. Maybe the person who took her. Maybe someone who saw something that morning and didn't realize its significance. Maybe someone who'd heard a confession, a boast, a slip of the tongue. Someone knew. But they weren't talking. Years collapsed into each other. The case of Bung Siriboon became one of those things people in Boronia remembered but didn't talk about. A shadow in the community's history. Parents held their children a little tighter. Students at St. Joseph's College knew the story. Some had been there the day Bung disappeared, though their memories of it faded and warped with time. The missing persons posters came down eventually. You can't keep them up forever. They fade in the sun, peel in the rain, become background noise that people stop seeing. But Vanita never stopped seeing. She'd walk the route herself sometimes. Elsie Street to Harcourt Road. Along that stretch where Bung was last spotted. Standing where her daughter had last stood, trying to see what Bung had seen. Trying to understand what had happened in those final moments. Because there had to have been a moment. A specific point in time when everything changed. When Bung went from being a girl walking to school to being gone. What did that moment look like? Was there a car? There must have been. You can't make a 13-year-old disappear on foot. Not that quickly. Not without someone noticing. So a vehicle? Probably. But what kind? A van? A sedan? Something unremarkable enough that it didn't draw attention? And how did they get her inside? This was the question that haunted investigators. Bung wasn't a small child. She was 13, old enough to fight, to scream, to resist. Even if someone had grabbed her, there should have been signs. A struggle. Witnesses drawn by noise. Something. Unless she didn't resist. This possibility was almost worse. It meant maybe she knew the person. Maybe she trusted them enough to approach their vehicle. To get inside willingly, thinking she was safe. Or maybe whoever took her was that good. That practiced. That efficient. The thought made everyone sick. Detectives built profiles. They consulted with behavioral analysts, with experts in child abduction, with people who'd worked similar cases. The conclusions were consistent and disturbing. Whoever took Bung had likely planned it. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, or if it was, the perpetrator was skilled enough to act on opportunity with frightening speed. They knew the area. They knew the timing. They knew how to execute an abduction in broad daylight without leaving evidence, which suggested this might not have been their first time. Police expanded their investigation beyond Boronia. They looked at unsolved disappearances across Victoria, across Australia, girls of similar age, similar circumstances, patterns that might connect. They found cases that made them wonder. A 14-year-old who'd vanished from a bus stop in 2009. A 12-year-old who'd disappeared walking home from a friend's house in 2007. Most had been found, some alive, some not, but a few remained mysteries. Were they connected? Probably not. Most likely not. Child abductions, while terrifying, are often isolated incidents. Different perpetrators, different motives, different outcomes. But the uncertainty gnawed at investigators. Because until Bung was found, until they knew what happened, they couldn't rule anything out. And Bung wasn't being found. The searches had covered everything within a reasonable radius of her disappearance point. Parks, reserves, bodies of water, abandoned buildings. Cadaver dogs had been through areas multiple times. Ground-penetrating radar had been used in locations where someone might bury remains. Nothing. Which meant either Bung wasn't in the area, she'd been taken somewhere far away, or whoever hid her had done it so well that professional searchers with specialized equipment couldn't find her. Both possibilities were horrifying. Vanita did what mothers of missing children do. She kept Bung's memory alive. She spoke at community events. She maintained a presence online, posting updates, sharing Bung's photo, pleading for information. The internet had changed things. Social media made it possible to reach people in ways that weren't possible before. A post could travel across the world in seconds. But it also meant Vanita had to read the comments, the theories, the accusations. Because people online feel entitled to opinions about tragedies they don't understand. Some blame the parents. You let her walk alone? She should have had her phone. You should have driven her. You should have been more careful. Others created elaborate conspiracy theories. Maybe Bung wasn't abducted. Maybe she ran away. Maybe the family was involved. Maybe it was all staged. These comments were cruel and baseless, but they persisted. They do in every case like this. People need explanations, even bad ones. Especially bad ones, sometimes, because bad explanations are better than no explanation at all. The truth was simpler and more painful. Bad things happen to good people. Evil exists. And sometimes it strikes so randomly, so efficiently, that there's no one to blame except the person who did it. And that person was still out there. In 2015, for years after Bung's disappearance, police held a press conference. It wasn't a major development. They had no new leads, no arrests, but they wanted to remind the public that the case remained active, that they still needed information. Detective Senior Sergeant Stuart Bailey spoke. He'd been involved from the beginning, and the weight of it showed in his face. "We know someone out there has information about what happened to Bung," he said. "Maybe you saw something that morning that didn't seem important at the time. Maybe you've heard something in the years since. Maybe someone you know has said something that made you uncomfortable, but you dismissed it." He paused, looked directly into the cameras. "We need you to come forward. This family deserves answers. Bung deserves to be found." The tip line received calls after that. Not many, but some. People remembering details they'd forgotten. A car they'd seen. A person who'd seemed out of place. Each tip was investigated thoroughly. None led anywhere. The hardest part of cold cases isn't the lack of evidence, though that's certainly a problem. It's the passage of time. Memories fade. Witnesses move away. Physical evidence degrades. The urgency that drives investigations in the first hours and days gradually dissipates into the steady, grinding work of following leads that probably won't pan out. Detectives don't give up. Most of them are too stubborn for that. But resources shift. New cases demand attention. The machinery of law enforcement has to keep moving. Bung's case remained open, officially, but the active daily investigation of those first weeks and months was gone. Instead, it became something different. A file that detectives would return to periodically, evidence they'd review with fresh eyes, technology they'd apply as it became available, DNA databases that might eventually contain a match to evidence collected from the scene, though what evidence they had, if any, was never publicly disclosed. The 10th anniversary arrived in 2021, a decade since Bung Siriboon walked out of her house on Elsie Street and vanished. The media covered it. 10 years since Bung Siriboon disappeared. Retrospectives were written. Vanita gave another interview. Older now, the pain etched into her face in ways that hadn't been there before. "I still hope," she said. "Every day I hope. That's what mothers do." The interview was heartbreaking. Not because Vanita broke down. She'd learned to control her grief in public, to compartmentalize it, but because of what wasn't said. The hope she expressed felt hollow. Obligatory. Like something you say because you have to, because giving up isn't an option, even when reality has already taken that option away. 10 years. A missing 13-year-old would be 23 now. An adult. If she was alive, she would have lived over half of her captivity by this point. A decade of being held by whoever took her. A decade of whatever that meant. Or she'd been dead within hours of her disappearance. Quick. Painless, hopefully. And her body was somewhere investigators hadn't looked, or had looked, but hadn't found. Neither possibility offered comfort. The 10th anniversary press conference yielded nothing new. No dramatic breaks. No sudden confessions. Just the same plea for information, the same assurance that the case remained active, the same grieving mother asking the public to help bring her daughter home. 3 more years passed. Bung would have been 26 by 2024, older than some of the officers working her case. A full adult with a life she never got to live. What would she have become? Vanita thought about this constantly. Would Bung have stayed in Australia or returned to Thailand? Would she have pursued mathematics or music? Would she have gone to university? Found love? Had children of her own? All of those futures evaporated on a Thursday morning in June. In less than 10 minutes on a suburban street. Gone. The case file grew thick with dead ends. Suspects who'd been investigated and cleared. Leads that went nowhere. Witness statements that contradicted each other or provided no useful information. Forensic analyses that revealed nothing relevant. But there was one aspect of the investigation that still bothered detectives. One element they couldn't quite reconcile. The attempted abduction that occurred weeks after Bung disappeared. The 16-year-old who'd been approached by a man in a vehicle. Who'd escaped. Initially, police had suspected a connection. The proximity in time and location seemed too coincidental. They'd investigated thoroughly, trying to link it to Bung's case. But then something happened. The 16-year-old's story changed. Details shifted. Under pressure, or perhaps just the weight of being involved in such a high-profile investigation. She admitted she'd exaggerated. Maybe even fabricated parts of it. It wasn't a complete lie. Something had happened. But it wasn't the dramatic attempted kidnapping she'd initially described. It was more ambiguous. A man who'd made her uncomfortable. A situation that felt wrong, but not necessarily criminal. The admission complicated everything. If that incident wasn't related to Bung's disappearance, then the pattern investigators thought they were seeing didn't exist. It was just a missing girl. A single, isolated event. Unless it wasn't. Because there were other incidents. Other reports of men approaching young girls in vehicles. Other moments of discomfort and fear that never escalated into something concrete enough for police to act on. Were they all unrelated? Statistical noise in a world where, sadly, young women experience harassment and intimidation regularly? Or was someone out there testing, probing for opportunities, looking for the right victim in the right circumstance? And had Bung Siriboon been that perfect circumstance? The questions multiplied faster than answers ever did. In late 2023, advances in forensic technology prompted a review of Bung's case. new DNA analysis techniques, better database matching. The possibility that evidence collected 13 years ago might yield results now that weren't possible then. The review happened quietly. No press conferences. No public announcements. Just detectives and forensic specialists going through everything again with new tools. If they found something significant, it wasn't shared publicly. Cold cases are handled delicately. You don't announce breakthroughs until you're certain. Until you have enough to act on. And as far as anyone outside the investigation could tell, nothing changed. Bung Siriboon remained missing. Her case remained open. Her family remained in limbo. This is the cruelty of unsolved disappearances. They never end. There's no closure. No grave to visit. No moment of goodbye. Just an absence that stretches across years and decades. A question that never gets answered. People move on eventually. They have to. Neighbors who remembered the case moved away. Students who'd gone to school with Bung graduated, went to university, started careers. The community changed. New families moved to Boronia, unaware of what happened there in 2011. Life continued. But for Vanita, Fred, and Pang, time froze on June 2nd, 2011. Every day since has been lived in the shadow of that morning. Every birthday, every holiday, every moment of happiness tainted by Bung's absence. Pang grew up without her sister. She's an adult now, though she was just a child when Bung disappeared. How do you process that? How do you build a life when half of your family history is an unanswered question? Fred still drives his truck routes. Still looks out the window at roadsides and wooded areas. Still wonders. Vanita still walks the route sometimes. Less frequently now. Her health isn't what it was, but she goes. Stands at that spot on Harcourt Road. 130 meters from the school. So close. The students at St. Joseph's College don't know the story anymore. Not really. It's history to them, if they know it at all. Something that happened before they were born or when they were too young to remember. The school has moved on. Had to. You can't build education around tragedy. But there's a memorial. Small. Easy to miss if you're not looking for it. A plaque with Bung's name. A reminder that she was real. That she mattered. That she's still missing. Because that's the present tense that no one wants to use, but that remains accurate. Missing. Not was missing. Is missing. Currently. Right now. Every second that passes, Bung Siriboon is missing. Somewhere she exists. As remains, most likely. Bones in a location no one has thought to search. Or buried so well that even when people searched the area, they didn't find her. Or, and this is the possibility that Vanita can't completely let go of, somewhere alive. Held captive. Surviving. It's not rational. Statistically, it's almost impossible. Child abduction victims who aren't found in the first 48 hours are almost never found alive. And it's been 13 years. 13 years of captivity would break most people. Leave them unrecognizable, even to family. But hope isn't rational. It doesn't follow statistics. It exists because the alternative is unbearable. So Vanita hopes. And waits. And checks her phone every time it rings, wondering if this will be the call. The detective with news. The break they've been waiting for. It never is. The investigation continues in the background. Detectives assigned to cold cases review Bung's file periodically. They check for new leads. They run evidence through updated databases. They wait for technology to advance enough that maybe, finally, it will reveal something. They've investigated hundreds of people over the years. Sex offenders. Suspicious individuals. People who knew the family. Strangers who lived in the area. Each one thoroughly vetted. Background checked. Interviewed. Alibis verified. None of them panned out. Or at least, none raised enough suspicion to warrant arrest and charges. Which means the person who took Bung is either incredibly lucky, incredibly careful, or someone police never considered. The first option, luck, seems unlikely. You don't abduct someone in broad daylight on a suburban street through luck. That requires planning, execution, skill. The second option, careful, is more probable. Someone who knew how to avoid leaving evidence. Who understood investigative techniques. Who covered their tracks so thoroughly that even trained detectives couldn't find them. Or the third option, someone police never considered. Someone who wasn't on any list. Who didn't fit any profile. Who had no criminal history, no red flags, nothing that would have drawn attention. A ghost. In some ways, that's the most frightening possibility. Because it means the person who took Bung could be anyone. Could still be out there, living a normal life, going to work, interacting with people, blending in, while in their past, hidden and buried, is the truth about what happened to a 13-year-old girl on a Thursday morning. The detectives working the case think about this. They have to. It's part of the job. You carry these cases with you. The unsolved ones especially. They haunt you. Stuart Bailey retired in 2022. He'd worked Bung's case for 11 years. When asked about it in his retirement interview, he said the thing that detectives always say about cases like this. I still think about her. I still hope we'll find her. And I still believe someone out there knows what happened. It's become almost a mantra, a statement of faith that truth will eventually surface. That justice, however delayed, will eventually arrive. But faith requires evidence at some point. And the evidence just isn't there. So the case sits, open but stagnant, active but cold, and Bung Siriboon remains missing. 13 years and counting. The word justice gets used a lot in true crime. Justice for the victim, justice for the family, as if finding the perpetrator, securing a conviction, imposing a sentence somehow balances the scales, somehow makes things right. But there's no making this right. Even if tomorrow someone confessed, even if Bung's remains were found and she could finally be laid to rest, even if the person responsible spent the rest of their life in prison, none of that would give Vanita back her daughter. None of it would return the 13 years Bung didn't get to live. Justice, in cases like this, is just a word we use because we don't have a better one. Because closure feels insulting and resolution is clinical and cold. What families really want is impossible. They want time to reverse. They want that Thursday morning to happen differently. They want their loved one back. And that's the one thing no investigation, no matter how thorough, can ever provide. So they settle for answers. For knowing. For not having to wonder anymore. But even that has been denied to Bung's family. The psychological toll of this kind of prolonged uncertainty is difficult to overstate. It's called ambiguous loss by therapists. Grief without closure. Mourning someone who might not be dead, but almost certainly is. It traps you in a permanent state of limbo. You can't fully grieve because there's no confirmation of death. But you can't fully hope because the reality is too grim. So you exist in between, suspended in a painful gray area. Vanita has lived in this space for 13 years. Every morning, waking up to the same unanswered question. Every night, going to bed with it still unresolved. It ages you in ways that time alone doesn't. The stress, the uncertainty, the endless loop of what-ifs and if-onlys. What if Bung had brought her phone that morning? What if the school had called to report her absence right away? What if someone on Harcourt Road had been looking out their window at exactly the right moment? These questions don't help. Vanita knows they don't help, but she can't stop asking them. Because somewhere in those what-ifs is the moment where everything could have been different. Where Bung could have been saved. Where this nightmare could have been prevented. But you can't change the past. You can only carry it. And the weight of it is crushing. Peng has tried to be strong for her mother. Tried to be the child who's still there, still alive, still present. But she knows she can never replace Bung. Can never fill that void. And she shouldn't have to. But she tries anyway, because what else can you do? Fred has become quieter over the years. More withdrawn. He works. He provides. He's there physically. But emotionally, part of him is still searching those roadsides. Still looking for some sign of the girl who never came home. This is what an unsolved disappearance does to a family. It doesn't just take one person. It takes pieces of everyone who loved them. The Siriboon household on Elsie Street is still there. The same house Bung left on that Thursday morning. Vanita couldn't bring herself to move. What if Bung came back and they weren't there? What if she somehow escaped and returned home and found strangers living in her house? It's not rational. Vanita knows this. But trauma and grief aren't rational. So they stayed. And Bung's room remained largely unchanged. A shrine to a life interrupted. To a future that never happened. Sometimes Vanita sits in there. On Bung's bed. Looking at her daughter's things. Textbooks that were studied 13 years ago. Clothes that would no longer fit. Posters on the wall of musicians and actors who've aged while Bung stayed frozen at 13. It's unbearably sad. But it's also the closest Vanita can get to her daughter now. In the broader community, there are people who remember. Who think about Bung, especially on significant dates. The anniversary of her disappearance. Her birthday. Sometimes just random Thursdays in June that remind them of what happened. They don't talk about it much. What is there to say? Nothing has changed. The case is still unsolved. Bung is still missing. But they remember. And in some small way, that matters. Because the worst thing that can happen to a missing person isn't just that they're never found. It's that they're forgotten. That their name fades. That their story becomes just another statistic. Bung Siriboon hasn't been forgotten. Not by her family. Not by the investigators who still work her case. Not by the community that watched her disappear. Her story endures. Her absence remains present. And somewhere, buried in someone's memory or conscience, is the truth about what happened on that Thursday morning in June 2011. Someone knows. The statement, "someone knows," has become almost ritualistic in missing persons cases. Detectives say it. Families plead it. Media reports echo it. But what does it actually mean? In Bung's case, it could mean several things. The person who took her obviously knows. But beyond that, maybe there's a witness who saw something but didn't recognize it as significant. Maybe there's a friend or family member of the perpetrator who noticed strange behavior but explained it away. Maybe there's someone who heard a confession years later, drunk or angry or guilty, and chose to dismiss it as rambling. Or maybe it means something darker. Maybe someone knows exactly what happened and has chosen, deliberately, to say nothing. This possibility haunts investigators more than almost anything else. The idea that someone could watch Vanita on television, pleading for information, and still remain silent. That someone could walk past the memorial at St. Joseph's College and feel nothing. That someone could carry this secret for 13 years without the weight of it breaking them. What kind of person does that? Psychology offers some answers, though they're not comforting. Psychopaths lack empathy. Sociopaths rationalize their behavior. Some people are simply so disconnected from normal emotional response that another person's suffering doesn't register as real to them. And then there are the enablers. The people who suspect something but don't want to believe it. Who see warning signs but explain them away because acknowledging the truth would shatter their own world. These people might not be malicious. They might be in denial. Or terrified. Or convinced that they're protecting someone they love. But their silence still kills. Still leaves families like Bung's in permanent agony. The investigation into Bung's disappearance had to consider all of these possibilities. They couldn't just look for a lone perpetrator. They had to consider accomplices, witnesses, people who knew something but weren't talking. In the first months after Bung vanished, police conducted psychological pressure campaigns. They released statements suggesting they were close to a breakthrough, hoping it would panic someone into making a mistake. They implied they had evidence they didn't actually have, hoping someone would come forward to explain it away and inadvertently reveal something. These are standard tactics. They work sometimes. People crack under pressure. They slip up. They make contact when they shouldn't. But in Bung's case, nothing happened. No one came forward. No one made incriminating statements. The psychological pressure met only silence, which suggested either the perpetrator was exceptionally disciplined, or there genuinely were no witnesses who understood what they'd seen. Both were possible. Both were frustrating. Detectives also had to consider the possibility that the person responsible had died. Car accident. Illness. Suicide. If the perpetrator was gone, the truth might have died with them. This happens more often than people realize. Cold cases get solved decades later when someone on their deathbed confesses. Or when someone dies and police search their property and find evidence of crimes no one suspected. Or when DNA from an old case matches someone who's been dead for years. But none of that had happened with Bung's case. Not yet, anyway. The investigation had expanded beyond just the immediate geography of Boronia. Detectives looked at transient populations, people who'd been in the area on June 2, 2011, but didn't live there. Truck drivers, delivery personnel, construction workers on temporary job sites, anyone who might have been passing through. This created an enormous pool of potential suspects. Too many to investigate thoroughly without more specific leads. So detectives prioritized. They focused on people with criminal histories, with prior sex offenses, with patterns of behavior that suggested they might be capable of child abduction. But the filtering process was imperfect. Because if the person who took Bung had no prior record, no criminal history, no red flags, they'd slip through any profile-based filter. And that was entirely possible. Most criminals start somewhere. First offenses happen. Maybe Bung's abduction was someone's first time. Their debut into something darker. Or maybe it wasn't their first time, but they'd never been caught before. Never been arrested. never entered the system in a way that would flag them. These are the suspects that terrify investigators most. The unknowns. The ones who don't appear in any database. Who blend seamlessly into normal society. Years into the investigation, police released a specific appeal. They asked for anyone who'd been driving along Harcourt Road between 8:30 and 9 a.m. on June 2, 2011, to come forward. Even if they didn't think they'd seen anything relevant. The logic was sound. Maybe someone had dashcam footage they'd forgotten about. Maybe someone remembered a vehicle pulled to the side of the road. Maybe someone had noticed a person standing near where Bung was last seen. The appeal generated responses. People called in with their recollections. Police followed up on each one. None provided the breakthrough they needed. But there was one response that stood out. A woman called to say she'd been driving to work that morning. She'd passed a section of Harcourt Road around 8:50 a.m., right in the critical window. She remembered seeing a girl in a school uniform walking alone. She couldn't say for certain it was Bung. She'd only seen her from behind, briefly, while driving past. But the timing and location aligned. More significantly, she remembered seeing a vehicle. A light-colored sedan, she thought. Older model. It had been driving slowly, almost crawling along Harcourt Road behind the girl. At the time, she hadn't thought anything of it. Maybe the driver was lost. Maybe they were looking for an address. People drive slowly in residential areas all the time. But looking back, with the knowledge of what happened, it seemed sinister. Like someone following. Stalking. Waiting for the right moment. The woman felt sick when she realized what she might have witnessed. The guilt of not reporting it at the time, of not recognizing danger when it was happening right in front of her. Detectives reassured her that she couldn't have known. That hindsight creates clarity that doesn't exist in the moment. That she was helping now, and that mattered. They asked for more details. Could she describe the vehicle more specifically? The driver? She couldn't. It had been years ago. She'd been focused on her own commute, not memorizing details of random cars. She thought the sedan might have been beige or light gray. She thought it might have been a Toyota or Honda, but she wasn't certain. She hadn't seen the driver at all, just the car. It was frustratingly vague. But it was also the most detailed potential sighting of Bung with a suspicious vehicle that investigators had received. They tried to enhance her memory through cognitive interview techniques. Specialists worked with her to reconstruct the scene, to recall sensory details she might have dismissed. The weather that morning, other vehicles on the road, landmarks she'd passed. Some additional details emerged. She remembered it had been cold. She'd had her heater on. She remembered the morning light, the way it slanted through her windshield. She remembered the girl's school uniform had been navy and maroon, St. Joseph's colors. This detail was significant. It corroborated that the girl the witness saw was likely Bung, or at least a student from the same school. And the presence of the slow-moving sedan in the same location at the same time was too coincidental to ignore. But they couldn't identify the vehicle. Without a license plate, without a more specific description, without any other witnesses who'd seen the same car, it was just another dead end. Still, it gave the investigation a focus. A working theory. Bung had been walking to school. Someone in a vehicle had been following her. They'd seen their opportunity, maybe when she reached a section of road without houses, or without pedestrians, or with enough tree cover to provide momentary concealment. They'd stopped, convinced her to approach, or forced her inside, and driven away. It would have taken seconds, maybe a minute, quick enough that no one realized what was happening until it was too late. The theory fit the evidence, or lack thereof. It explained the complete absence of witnesses. It explained why Bung's belongings were never found scattered on the ground, which might have happened if she'd been grabbed while walking. It explained the narrow time window. But it also raised questions. If someone had been following Bung, had they followed her before? Was June 2, 2011, just the day they finally acted, or was it their first time seeing her? Detectives went back through their files. They looked for reports of suspicious vehicles in Boronia in the weeks and months before Bung's disappearance. They found some. There are always reports of suspicious vehicles in any community, but nothing that definitively connected to the light-colored sedan. They also considered whether the perpetrator might have been familiar with Bung's routine, whether they'd studied her schedule, learned when she walked to school, identified the vulnerable points in her route. This suggested premeditation. Planning. Someone who'd spent time preparing for this moment. It also suggested that Bung might not have been the first target considered. Maybe the perpetrator had watched other girls, other routes, other schools, and Bung had simply been the one where circumstances aligned. This possibility led investigators down another dark path. If the person who took Bung had been planning this, studying routines, looking for opportunities, had they tried before? Were there other incidents that police had dismissed as unrelated? They re-examined every report of suspicious behavior toward children in the area. A man watching a playground too intently. Someone asking students for directions with a story that seemed off. Vehicles that had circled school zones multiple times. Most of these reports led nowhere. They were misunderstandings, or overreactions, or genuinely innocent situations misinterpreted through paranoid lenses. But some made investigators uncomfortable. Patterns that almost connected. Behaviors that seemed rehearsed. Near misses where something had almost happened but didn't. One report from May 2011, just weeks before Bung disappeared, described a man in his 30s or 40s who'd approached a group of girls walking home from school. He'd asked if they wanted a ride. They'd declined and walked faster. He'd driven away. The girls had been frightened enough to tell their parents, who'd reported it to police. But the man hadn't committed a crime. Offering a ride isn't illegal. Creepy, perhaps. Inappropriate. But not criminal. Police had investigated at the time. They'd increased patrols in the area. But without a license plate or a clear description of the vehicle, the girls had been too scared to notice details. There wasn't much they could do. Now, looking back, detectives wondered, had that been the same person who took Bung? Had they been testing responses? Seeing how children reacted? Learning what worked and what didn't? They tried to locate those girls, now adults. 2 were found and interviewed. Their memories had faded with time, but they still remembered being frightened. Still remembered the man's insistence that he could give them a ride. Still remembered how he'd smiled at them in a way that felt wrong. Could they describe him? The vehicle? Not really. Not in any detail that helped. One thought he'd had dark hair. The other thought it might have been brown or gray. Both remembered the vehicle being a sedan, but couldn't agree on the color. It was maddeningly vague, but it was also suggestive. A pattern, maybe, or just coincidence. The frustration of cold case investigation is that everything looks like either a clue or a coincidence, and you can never be certain which until you solve the case. And then, in retrospect, all the clues seem obvious and all the coincidences seem dismissible. But in the moment, while the case is still open, while the answer still eludes you, every detail could be everything or nothing. Detectives working Bung's case had to live in that uncertainty. Had to follow leads that probably wouldn't pan out because they might. Had to treat every tip as potentially significant because the one time they didn't could be the time it actually mattered. It's exhausting work. Psychologically grinding. You're constantly hoping for a breakthrough while simultaneously bracing for disappointment. And in Bung's case, there had been so much disappointment. But they couldn't stop. Because somewhere, the truth existed. Somewhere Bung was dead, almost certainly. But somewhere. In a location that had meaning to her abductor, or in a random spot chosen for convenience, or buried in a place that would never be found without confession. Forensic teams had done everything they could with the physical evidence from the scene, which amounted to almost nothing. The stretch of Harcourt Road where Bung was last seen had been examined thoroughly. Soil samples taken. Fibers collected. Anything that might have DNA or trace evidence. But Harcourt Road was a public street. Hundreds of people walked it daily. Cars drove over it constantly. Isolating specific evidence connected to Bung's disappearance from the general environmental contamination was nearly impossible. They found fibers that didn't match anything Bung owned. But they also couldn't conclusively link them to her abduction. They might have been there before. They might have arrived after. They might have nothing to do with the case at all. DNA analysis found genetic material from dozens of people. Again, unsurprising for a public space. Without a suspect to compare it against, the DNA was just data sitting in a database, waiting for a match that might never come. This is one of the cruel ironies of modern forensic science. We have incredible tools. We can extract DNA from microscopic samples. We can match it across databases. We can solve decades-old cases with a single genetic profile. But it only works if the perpetrator is in the system, if they've committed another crime. If they've been arrested, swabbed, entered into the database. And if they haven't, all the sophisticated science in the world can't help you. The perpetrator in Bung's case was either phenomenally lucky or phenomenally careful. Or both. They'd executed an abduction without leaving usable evidence. Without being seen clearly by witnesses. Without triggering any of the systems designed to catch predators. They'd vanished Bung Siriboon as completely as if she'd never existed. And then they'd vanished themselves. This level of success suggested experience. Detectives didn't want to believe it, but the possibility had to be confronted. Maybe this wasn't the perpetrator's first victim. They expanded their search beyond Victoria, beyond Australia. They looked at international databases of missing children, unsolved abductions, patterns that might match. The problem with pattern analysis in crimes like this is that child abductions, while horrific, aren't actually that rare globally. Thousands of children go missing every year. Most are found. Many run away. Some are abducted by family members in custody disputes. But a percentage, a small, terrible percentage, are abducted by strangers. And of those, an even smaller percentage are never found. Bung belonged to that smallest category. The statistical outliers. The cases that remain open for decades. Detectives found other cases with superficial similarities. Girls around Bung's age, walking to or from school, disappeared without trace. But similarities don't equal connections. Without physical evidence linking cases, without a clear modus operandi, you're just guessing. And guessing doesn't solve cases. So they stayed focused on Bung. On the specific facts of her disappearance. On the narrow window of time and space where she'd ceased to exist as a free person. Somewhere in that window was the answer. Somewhere in those few minutes between 8:55 a.m. and when she should have arrived at school was the moment that explained everything. But it remained hidden, locked away in the memory of whoever was there. Whoever saw, whoever took her. And they weren't talking. The psychological profile of Bung's abductor, developed by behavioral specialists and refined over years, painted a disturbing picture. Male, almost certainly. The overwhelming majority of child abductions are committed by men. Age range probably between late 20s and 50s. Old enough to have the confidence and means to execute the crime. Young enough to overpower a 13-year-old. Likely lived or worked in the area. The timing and location suggested familiarity with Boronia, with school schedules, with the rhythms of suburban morning routines. Possibly had a legitimate reason to be in the area that morning. A job that took him through Boronia. A commute that passed along Harcourt Road. Something that wouldn't have seemed suspicious if someone had noticed his vehicle. Intelligent and organized. The lack of evidence suggested planning and careful execution. This wasn't a chaotic, impulsive crime. Likely functioned normally in society. Held a job. Had relationships. Might even have a family. The stereotype of the creepy loner living in isolation doesn't match most criminals like this. Many are hiding in plain sight. Their dark impulses compartmentalized away from their public lives. The profile was helpful in theory. It narrowed the suspect pool from everyone to specific types of people. But in practice, it described hundreds of men in the Boronia area. Maybe thousands if you expanded the radius. And without more specific evidence, there was no way to narrow it further. So detectives worked systematically. They cleared suspects one by one. Interviewed them. Checked alibis. Looked for connections to Bung or her family. Each cleared suspect was a small victory, one less possibility, but also a defeat. Because if they were clearing innocent people, it meant they still hadn't found the guilty one. The years accumulated. The investigation continued. But progress remained elusive. And Bung remained missing. There's a phenomenon in long-term missing persons cases that investigators rarely talk about publicly. It's the slow erosion of certainty. In the beginning, everything feels possible. You believe you'll find the victim. You believe someone will talk. You believe that good detective work and modern technology and sheer determination will eventually reveal the truth. But as months become years, as years become a decade, that certainty starts to crack. Not the commitment. Detectives don't stop caring, don't stop working the case. But the belief that resolution is imminent, that breakthrough is just around the corner, gradually fades into something more resigned, more realistic. You start to think in terms of if rather than when. If we find her body, if someone confesses, if technology advances enough, if the perpetrator commits another crime and gets caught. If. This shift happened in Bung's case too, though no one involved would admit it directly. The press conferences became less frequent. The public appeals more ritualistic. The investigation continued, but the urgency, that electric feeling that drives those first crucial hours and days, had long since dissipated. What remained was something quieter, more methodical. Detectives reviewing files periodically, checking for new developments, following up on occasional tips, waiting for the break that might never come. This is the reality of cold cases. They don't stay hot through force of will. They cool naturally, inevitably, until they're maintained more than actively pursued. But cold doesn't mean forgotten, and it doesn't mean unsolvable. Sometimes cases that have been cold for decades suddenly break open. A deathbed confession, a piece of evidence re-examined with new technology, a witness who finally decides to speak. Luck masquerading as justice. The investigators working Bung's case held on to this possibility. They'd seen it happen in other cases. They knew it was possible. But possibility and probability are different things. And the probability decreased with every passing year. In 2019, 8 years after Bung's disappearance, there was a moment where everything seemed to shift. A phone call came into the tip line. Anonymous. Male voice. Nervous. The caller said he knew something about what happened to Bung Siriboon. The officer who took the call went through the standard protocol. Calm voice. Gentle questions. Trying to keep the caller on the line, trying to extract information without spooking them. What did he know? Could he be more specific? The caller hesitated. Long silence. Then, I know where she is. The officer's pulse quickened. Every tip line worker has this moment. The call that might be real. That might be the one. Where? Can you tell us where? Another pause. Then the caller said an address. A property in rural Victoria, about 2 hours from Boronia. Farmland, mostly abandoned. The caller said Bung had been buried there in 2011. How did he know this? The caller wouldn't say, just repeated that she was there. Then hung up. The call was traced immediately, but it had come from a prepaid mobile phone. Untraceable. No name attached. The number was never used again. Still, police had to investigate. An address had been provided, specific enough to act on. Within 24 hours, cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar were on site. The property was exactly as described. Rural, isolated, largely abandoned except for an elderly couple who owned it, but rarely visited. The couple was interviewed. They knew nothing about Bung's case. They'd never met the Siriboon family. They'd owned the property for decades, but used it maybe once or twice a year for hunting. Could someone have accessed the property without their knowledge? Easily. It was remote, unfenced in places. You could drive onto it from several access points without anyone noticing. The search began. Teams walked the property systematically. Cadaver dogs, trained to detect decomposition, worked the areas most likely to conceal remains. Ground-penetrating radar scanned for disturbances in the soil that might indicate a burial site. They worked for 3 days. Covered every meter of the property. Checked out buildings, wells, anywhere a body might have been hidden. They found nothing. No remains. No disturbed earth suggesting a burial. No trace of Bung Siriboon. The tip had been false. Either a cruel hoax, or someone who genuinely believed they knew something but was wrong, or a tactic to waste police resources. False tips happen constantly in high-profile cases. Some people crave attention. Others genuinely misinterpret dreams or hunches as real knowledge. A few actively enjoy the cruelty of giving false hope. Detectives working Bung's case had learned to manage their expectations. To investigate every lead, but not invest emotionally until there was concrete evidence. Still, the 2019 tip stung. For a brief moment, there had been hope. Real, tangible hope that maybe, finally, Bung would be found. That Vanita could lay her daughter to rest. That the years of uncertainty could end. Instead, it was just another disappointment in a case defined by them. Vanita heard about the search through media reports before police could contact her directly. She'd seen the news vans heading toward the rural property. Seen the speculation online. She'd allowed herself to hope too. When detectives finally called to tell her they'd found nothing, she didn't cry. She'd cried so much over the years that somewhere along the way, the tears had stopped coming as easily. She just said, "Okay, thank you for looking." The quiet acceptance was somehow worse than grief. It was the sound of someone who'd learned not to expect closure, who'd adapted to living in permanent uncertainty. This is what long-term missing persons cases do to families. They don't just cause grief, They cause a specific kind of psychological damage that has no name. The inability to fully mourn. The constant low-level stress of not knowing. The hope that won't die but also can't be fulfilled. It rewires your brain. Changes how you interact with the world. Every phone call could be the news you've been waiting for. Every knock on the door could be police with information. Every media report about recovered remains makes your heart stop until you confirm it's not your loved one. You exist in a state of permanent anticipation that never resolves. Pang, Bung's younger sister, struggled with this differently than her mother. She'd been so young when Bung disappeared that her memories of her sister were fragmentary, more constructed from photographs and family stories than from actual lived experience. She knew Bung theoretically, but she didn't really remember her. Not in the way you remember someone you've actually known. This created its own kind of grief. Loss for something she barely had. A sister who existed more as absence than presence in her life. Growing up in the shadow of a missing sibling is complicated. Everyone in the family is focused on the one who's gone. The one who's still there, still alive, still present, still needing attention and love, can feel invisible. Pang never said this directly. She loved her mother. She understood the pain Vanita was in. But the feeling was there, unavoidable. The sense that she could never compete with Bung's absence. That being alive and present wasn't as important as being missing and mourned. Therapists who work with families of missing persons recognize this dynamic. The living siblings often struggle with guilt. Guilt for being alive when their sibling might not be. Guilt for feeling resentful of the attention the missing person receives. Guilt for moving on with their lives when their family is frozen in trauma. Pang tried to be strong. Tried to be there for her mother. Tried to live a normal life, school, friends, eventually university, and a career. But normal was impossible in a family where one member's absence defined everything. Fred, Bung's stepfather, dealt with it by working. Long hours. Constant motion. If he stayed busy enough, he didn't have to think. Didn't have to feel. This is a common coping mechanism. Work becomes armor. Routine becomes escape. You convince yourself that providing, that maintaining normalcy in other areas, is how you honor the missing person. But it also creates distance. Emotional unavailability. A family where everyone is grieving, but no one is really together in that grief. The Siriboon household became a collection of individual sorrows rather than a unified family unit processing trauma together. This isn't unusual. Grief, especially prolonged uncertain grief, is isolating. Everyone experiences it differently. Everyone needs different things. And often, the people who should be able to support each other are too deep in their own pain to reach out. Vanita sometimes wondered what Bung would think of what her disappearance had done to the family. Would she understand? Would she be horrified at the permanent wound her absence had created? These thoughts were irrational. Bung hadn't chosen this, hadn't wanted to disappear, but they came anyway. Late at night, when Vanita couldn't sleep, when the silence of the house felt suffocating. What would Bung be now if she'd lived? Who would she have become? 26 years old. Probably finished university. Maybe working. Maybe married. Maybe with children of her own. Or maybe none of those things. Maybe she would have struggled. Made mistakes. Disappointed expectations. Been gloriously, messily human in all the ways that real people are. The tragedy of missing persons isn't just the absence. It's the idealization. The way the missing person becomes frozen in time, perfect and unchanging, while everyone who knew them ages and changes and becomes complicated. Bung would always be 13 in family photographs. Always in her school uniform. Always on the verge of a life that never happened. The investigators who'd worked her case longest sometimes thought about this too. About who Bung might have become if that Thursday morning had gone differently. Stuart Bailey, the detective who'd led the investigation for over a decade, had a photograph of Bung on his desk even after he retired. Not the one the media always used. The school photo where she looked serious and slightly uncomfortable with the camera. A different one. A candid shot someone had taken at a family gathering. Bung was laughing, eyes bright, genuinely happy. It was the kind of photograph that captured personality more than appearance. Bailey kept it as a reminder of what they were really looking for. Not just answers. Not just closure for the family. But justice for a girl who deserved to laugh like that for many more years. He'd worked hundreds of cases over his career. Solved most of them. But the ones that stayed with you weren't the successes. They were the failures. The cases that remained open. The people you couldn't bring home. Bung was one of those. She'd haunt him for the rest of his life. The detective who'd taken over the case after Bailey's retirement, a younger woman named Detective Senior Constable Emma Charlotte, approached it with fresh eyes, but similar dedication. Charlotte had reviewed every file, every witness statement, every piece of evidence. She'd re-interviewed people where possible. She'd applied new analytical techniques to old data. She'd found some interesting threads, small inconsistencies in statements, witnesses whose accounts didn't quite match, alibis that seemed solid but had tiny gaps, but nothing concrete, nothing that rose to the level of evidence. Just questions that couldn't be answered 13 years after the fact. Charlotte believed the answer was in those first few hours, in the immediate aftermath of Bung's disappearance, before people had time to forget details or construct narratives. Somewhere in those initial witness statements was a clue everyone had missed. She read and reread them until she could recite them from memory. The neighbor who'd seen Bung leave her house at 8:20 a.m. Normal. Nothing unusual. The witness who'd spotted her on Harcourt Road at 8:55 a.m. Walking alone. School uniform. Backpack. The woman who remembered the slow-moving sedan. Light-colored. Following the girl. And then nothing. No other confirmed sightings. No witnesses coming forward with additional information. That gap, those few minutes between 8:55 and when Bung should have arrived at school, contained everything. The answer was somewhere in there. Charlotte tried to reconstruct it. She walked the route herself multiple times, at the same time of day, on similar mornings. She timed how long it took. She looked for sight lines, for places where someone could be hidden from view even briefly. Harcourt Road had houses, but they were set back from the street. There were trees, driveways, cars parked along the curb. 100 small pockets where someone could pause, where a vehicle could pull over, where an interaction could happen without being immediately visible from neighboring properties. It wouldn't require much. Just seconds of privacy. Just enough time for someone to convince or force Bung into a vehicle. A friendly face asking for directions. Someone claiming to know her family. A ruse, however simple, to get her close enough to grab. Or a more violent approach. A hand over her mouth. A weapon implied or displayed. Terror rendering her compliant. Charlotte didn't like thinking about those final moments. About what Bung might have felt. The confusion. The fear. The betrayal of safety in a neighborhood she knew. But she had to think about it. Had to understand the mechanics of how this happened if she was going to solve it. The problem remained the same as it had been from day one. No witnesses to the actual abduction. No forensic evidence. No body. No confession. Just absence. Just questions. Charlotte attended one of the annual memorial services held at St. Joseph's College. It was a small gathering, mostly family, a few community members who still remembered, some current students who'd learned Bung's story as part of the school's history. Vanita was there, older now, her face carved with grief. She lit a candle, said a few words about her daughter, about hope, about never giving up. Charlotte watched and felt the weight of responsibility. This was why she did this work. Not for the statistics or the career advancement. For people like Vanita who deserved answers. After the service, Charlotte approached Vanita. They'd spoken before, but only in official capacities. This felt different. More personal. "I'm still looking," Charlotte said. "I want you to know that." Vanita smiled sadly. "I know. Thank you." There wasn't much else to say. Chen couldn't promise results. Couldn't guarantee closure. Could only promise continued effort. It seemed inadequate, but it was all she had. As Charlotte walked back to her car, she noticed something. The school had changed since 2011. New buildings. Different landscaping. The physical environment Bung had known was disappearing, being replaced and updated and modernized. Soon, there would be no one at the school who remembered the day Bung didn't arrive. No teachers who'd marked her absent. No students who'd noticed her empty desk. The living memory of her would fade, leaving only official records and family grief. This happens in all cold cases eventually. The people who knew the victim age and die. The community moves on. The case becomes historical rather than current. But some cases, a rare few, get solved anyway. Decades later. Through DNA matches, or deathbed confessions, or random discoveries. Charlotte had to believe Bung's case could be one of those. Had to believe that somewhere, the evidence existed. The truth was waiting. She just had to find it. Back at the station, Charlotte pulled up the digital case files again. Thousands of pages of reports, statements, analyses. She'd read most of it multiple times, but she did it again. Because somewhere in there might be the detail everyone had overlooked. The connection no one had made. The piece that would make everything else make sense. She started with the timeline again. Always the timeline. Because time doesn't lie. People do. Memories fail. But the sequence of events, properly reconstructed, tells the truth. 8:20 a.m. Bung leaves home. 8:22 a.m. approximately. Neighbor sees her 2 houses down. 8:55 a.m. Final confirmed sighting on Harcourt Road. 9 a.m. School starts. Bung is marked absent. Between 8:55 and 9 o'clock, something happened. 5 minutes. Maybe less. Charlotte pulled up maps of the area. Looked at the exact location of that final sighting. Measured distances to the school. To nearby properties. To intersections where a vehicle could turn and disappear. She noted which houses had clear sight lines to the street. Which ones had been occupied that morning. Some residents were at work, others were home, but not looking out windows at the critical time. She made a list of every vehicle known to have been in the area. Delivery trucks. Service vehicles. Residents leaving for work. The light-colored sedan the one witness remembered. That sedan kept drawing her attention. It was the only potentially suspicious element in an otherwise normal morning. Everything else had explanations. Context. Legitimate reasons for being there. But a vehicle slowly following a young girl? That was different. Charlotte tried to trace it. Had anyone else seen a similar vehicle that morning? What about in the days before? Had there been reports of a light-colored sedan cruising through Boronia, watching schools, following students? She found a few reports, but they were vague. Light-colored sedans are common. Without license plates or more specific identifying features, they could have been completely different vehicles. Still, she documented them, added them to her timeline, looked for patterns. One report from 3 days before Bung's disappearance caught her attention. A parent had called police about a car that had been parked near the school for over an hour, just sitting there. The driver inside, watching students. When a school staff member had approached to ask if they needed help, the driver had started the vehicle and driven away. Not quickly, not suspiciously, just left. The staff member hadn't gotten the license plate. Described the vehicle as a sedan, possibly beige or tan. Medium-sized. Driver was male, possibly middle-aged, but seen from a distance, so the description was unreliable. Could this have been the same vehicle? The same person? Possibly. Or it could have been someone waiting for their child, someone who got uncomfortable when approached and decided to leave. Without more information, it was impossible to know. But Charlotte added it to her running theory. Someone had been watching the school. Watching students. Maybe watching Bung specifically. On June 2nd, 2011, they'd acted. The theory of surveillance, that someone had been watching Bung before they took her, led Charlotte down a different investigative path. If the perpetrator had been observing her routine, they would have needed opportunities to do so without drawing attention. They would have needed to be in the area repeatedly, regularly enough to learn Bung's schedule, but not so often that neighbors noticed a stranger. This suggested someone who belonged in the area, or at least, someone who had a reason to be there that wouldn't raise suspicion. Charlotte compiled a new list, broader than previous ones. She included delivery drivers who serviced the Boronia area regularly, utility workers who might have been doing repairs or maintenance, contractors working on nearby construction or renovation projects, parents of students at St. Joseph's College who would have been in the area during school drop-off times, local business owners whose work brought them through the neighborhood, residents who commuted through Harcourt Road daily. The list was enormous. Hundreds of people. Too many to investigate individually without more specific leads. But Charlotte was looking for overlaps. People who appeared in multiple contexts. Who'd been interviewed about something else and perhaps hadn't been thoroughly vetted. Who'd given statements that seemed innocuous at the time but might deserve a second look. She found something interesting buried in the files. A brief mention, barely a footnote. In the weeks after Bung's disappearance, police had interviewed employees at a telecommunications company that had been doing work in Boronia. They'd been installing new infrastructure, phone lines, internet cables. Their vehicles had been visible throughout the suburb for months, including in June 2011. The workers had been interviewed as potential witnesses. Had they seen anything unusual on June 2nd? Anyone acting suspiciously? They'd all said no. They'd been asked to account for their locations that morning. Most had alibis. They were working in teams, so they could vouch for each other. Others had been at job sites with property owners who confirmed their presence. One worker, however, had been alone that morning. He'd been assigned to inspect equipment in a different part of Boronia. Not near Harcourt Road, but not far either. Within a few kilometers. He'd told police he was working all morning. Hadn't seen anything relevant. Hadn't been near the school. His name was Michael Horvath. 42 years old at the time. No criminal record. Married. 2 children of his own. He'd worked for the telecommunications company for 15 years. By all accounts, a normal, reliable employee. Police had cleared him. Moved on to other potential witnesses and suspects. Charlotte pulled up everything she could find on Horvath. Employment records. DMV information. Property records. He'd owned a vehicle in 2011. A 1998 Honda Accord. Light beige. Charlotte felt something shift in her chest. The witness who'd seen the slow-moving sedan behind Bung had described it as light-colored, possibly beige, possibly a Toyota or Honda. It wasn't definitive. Thousands of people drove light-colored Honda sedans. But it was worth examining more closely. She dug deeper into Horvath's statement from 2011. He'd told investigators he was working on the other side of Boronia that morning. But when Charlotte looked at the work orders from his company, something didn't align perfectly. The job he'd been assigned that day was scheduled to take about 3 hours. He'd signed in at the location at 7:30 a.m. Signed out at 11:15 a.m. That gave him nearly 4 hours for a 3-hour job. Not unusual. Work often takes longer than estimated. But it left a window. Time unaccounted for. Time when he could have been somewhere else. Like Harcourt Road at 8:55 a.m. Charlotte was careful not to get ahead of herself. This was speculation. Circumstantial thinking. Not evidence. But it was worth investigating. She checked if Horvath still lived in the area. He didn't. He'd moved in 2014, 3 years after Bung's disappearance, relocating to Queensland with his family. Different state. Over 1,000 kilometers away. The move itself wasn't suspicious. People relocate for jobs, for family, for lifestyle changes. Moving 3 years after an unsolved crime in your area didn't implicate you in that crime. But Charlotte made a note of it anyway. She tried to track Horvath's current whereabouts. Found that he still worked in telecommunications, though for a different company now. Still married to the same woman. Children now adults. No criminal record. No arrests. No red flags in the 13 years since Bung disappeared. On paper, Michael Horvath looked like exactly what he'd claimed to be in 2011. An innocent witness who happened to work in the area, but had nothing to do with the case. But Charlotte had learned that monsters don't always look like monsters. They look like regular people. They have jobs and families and normal lives. They compartmentalize their darkness so effectively that even people close to them don't see it. She needed more information. Needed to rule Horvath out completely or develop enough evidence to justify reopening his interview. Charlotte contacted the telecommunications company Horvath had worked for in 2011. They still had employment records, though they required a warrant to release detailed information. Charlotte worked on securing that. While she waited, she looked at other aspects of the case. The attempted abduction of the 16-year-old girl that had occurred weeks after Bung disappeared. The one where the victim had later admitted to exaggerating or possibly fabricating details. Charlotte reread that report carefully. The girl, now a woman in her late 20s, had described a man in a vehicle approaching her, asking if she needed a ride, making her uncomfortable. The description of the vehicle was vague. The description of the man even more so. But one detail stood out. The girl had said the man mentioned he worked for a phone company, that he was installing new lines in the area and knew her street. That's why she should trust him. This detail had been buried in the report. Dismissed, perhaps, when the girl's story started to fall apart under questioning. But what if that specific detail, the phone company, had been true? What if she'd exaggerated her response, made the encounter seem more threatening than it was, but the basic facts were accurate? A man working for a telecommunications company, driving through suburban streets, approaching young girls. Charlotte felt the pieces starting to align. Not conclusively. Not enough for an arrest or even a formal accusation. But enough to justify deeper investigation. She tracked down the woman who'd been 16 at the time. Her name was Sophie Grimshaw. She lived in Melbourne still, working as a teacher. Charlotte called her. Asked if she'd be willing to discuss the incident from 2011. Sophie was hesitant at first. I told police back then that I wasn't entirely truthful about what happened. I was scared and I made it sound worse than it was. I understand, Charlotte said. I'm not calling to accuse you of anything. I'm just trying to clarify some details. The man who approached you, you mentioned he said he worked for a phone company. Yes, that's actually true. He had some kind of badge or ID hanging from his shirt. That's why I thought it might be okay at first when he started talking to me. Can you describe him at all? Sophie thought for a moment. It was so long ago. I remember he seemed normal. Like, not particularly threatening to look at. Middle-aged, I think. Maybe 40-something. Brown hair, or maybe it was graying. Average build. He smiled a lot, which was actually part of what made me uncomfortable. Like he was trying too hard to seem friendly. And the vehicle? Beige or tan? Four-door sedan. I didn't get the license plate, or anything specific. Did he touch you? Or just talk to you? Just talked. He asked where I lived. Asked if I needed a ride. I said no and started walking faster. He drove slowly alongside me for a bit, still talking. Then he just drove off. Did he seem angry when you refused? No. That's the weird part. He just smiled and said something like, okay, well, you have a good day, and left. Which is why I felt stupid later for being so scared. But at the time, something about the whole thing felt wrong. You know, Charlotte knew. Predators often test boundaries. See how potential victims react. The ones who resist or run get dismissed. The ones who seem vulnerable, who might be manipulated or overpowered, get targeted. Maybe Bung had seemed vulnerable to whoever approached her. Maybe she'd been polite when she should have run. Maybe she'd believed the story about needing directions or knowing her family. Or maybe the perpetrator hadn't bothered with manipulation. Maybe they just grabbed her. Fast and efficient and brutal. Sophie, I know this was 13 years ago, but do you remember what the company was? What his ID badge said? No. Sorry. I just remember it was a phone or internet company. Something like that. It wasn't definitive, but it was another point of alignment. The warrant came through for Horvath's employment records. Charlotte spent an afternoon going through them in detail. His work schedule for June 2011 showed him assigned to jobs throughout Boronia. Multiple addresses. Multiple days. He'd been a visible presence in the area for weeks leading up to Bung's disappearance. Exactly the kind of presence that would allow someone to observe routines without raising suspicion. Charlotte looked at the specific job sites. Mapped them. None were directly on Harcourt Road, but several were within a few blocks. Close enough that someone driving between locations would pass through the area where Bung was last seen. She found his timesheets. The morning of June 2nd, he'd signed in at 7:30 a.m. at a location about 2 kilometers from Harcourt Road. His next documented activity was signing out at 11:15 a.m. Nearly 4 hours with minimal documentation of what he'd actually done during that time. This wasn't unusual for field work. Technicians often worked independently. They weren't monitored minute by minute. As long as the job got done, the company didn't track every movement. But it created opportunity. Unaccounted time. Windows where Horvath could have been anywhere. Charlotte needed more. She couldn't bring someone in for questioning based on owning a beige Honda and having flexible work hours 13 years ago. She needed something concrete. She started looking at Horvath's life after 2011. Looking for patterns. For behavior that might suggest guilt or continued predatory actions. She found nothing obvious. No arrests. No restraining orders. No complaints filed against him. His children were grown now, apparently healthy and normal. His marriage appeared stable. If Horvath had abducted and murdered Bung Siriboon, he'd done it once and then stopped. Lived the rest of his life as a regular person. It was possible. Some criminals are opportunistic rather than compulsive. They commit a terrible crime once, under specific circumstances, and then never do it again. But it was unusual. Most predators who successfully abduct and murder don't stop. The successful commission of such a crime tends to reinforce the behavior. They do it again, get caught eventually, or die with multiple victims nobody knows about. A one-time offender who then lives normally for over a decade wasn't the typical pattern. But atypical didn't mean impossible. Charlotte decided she needed to talk to Horvath directly. Not officially. Not yet. Just a casual conversation. Enough to get a read on him. To see if he reacted oddly to questions about 2011. She flew to Queensland. Didn't tell Horvath she was coming. Just showed up at his workplace one afternoon. He was working at a telecommunications depot, managing installations rather than doing field work now. He'd moved up in the company. Supervisory role. Office with his name on the door. Charlotte introduced herself. Showed her credentials. Said she was following up on some old cases from Victoria, including the Bung Siriboon disappearance. Horvath's expression didn't change. No visible nervousness. No immediate defensiveness. I remember that case, he said. Terrible thing. I talked to police back then. I was working in Boronia at the time. Right. That's actually why I'm here. Just doing a comprehensive review, re-interviewing witnesses, making sure we didn't miss anything. Of course. Happy to help if I can. They sat in his office. Charlotte asked basic questions. Where exactly had he been working on June 2nd, 2011? What time had he arrived? What did the job entail? Horvath answered everything calmly. His story matched what he'd told investigators 13 years ago. Same details. Same timeline. Either he was telling the truth, or he'd rehearsed his story so many times that it was completely consistent. Charlotte watched his body language. Looked for micro-expressions. Signs of stress or deception. He seemed comfortable. Cooperative. Maybe slightly curious about why this was coming up again after so many years, but not defensive about it. Did you ever see Bung Siriboon? Charlotte asked. Either that morning or in the weeks before. I don't think so. I mean, I was in the area a lot, so I probably saw lots of kids in school uniforms. But no one specific that I remember. What about your vehicle? You drove a beige Honda Accord at the time, correct? That's right. Had it for years. Reliable car. Did you ever pick anyone up? Give anyone a ride? For the first time, Horvath's expression shifted slightly. Not guilt. More like confusion. Like hitchhikers? No. Company policy was against that. Plus I had equipment in the car most of the time. Not really room for passengers. Charlotte nodded. Made notes. Let silence stretch between them. Some people can't handle silence. They fill it. Start talking to ease their own discomfort. Sometimes they say more than they should. Horvath just waited. Patient. Still calm. Mr. Horvath, where did you move to in 2014? And why? Queensland. Brisbane area. My wife got a job opportunity here. Better pay, better lifestyle. We've been talking about leaving Melbourne for a while. Seemed like good timing. Did the Bung Siriboon case have anything to do with your decision to leave? Horvath looked genuinely surprised by the question. No. Why would it? I didn't know the family. Didn't have anything to do with what happened. It was just something awful that happened in the area where I was working. He paused, then added, Are you suggesting I'm a suspect? Charlotte kept her expression neutral. I'm not suggesting anything. Just doing thorough follow-up. Because if I'm a suspect, I should probably have a lawyer present for this conversation. You're not under arrest, Mr. Horvath. You're free to end this conversation at any time. I'm just asking questions. He considered this, then nodded. Okay, but I need to be clear. I had nothing to do with that girl's disappearance. Nothing. I've thought about it over the years. Of course I have. It's haunting. But I didn't see anything that morning. I wasn't anywhere near where she went missing. Your work site was about 2 kilometers away. Right? On the other side of the suburb. I didn't go near the school that day. Charlotte made more notes. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but she couldn't identify what. Horvath wasn't obviously lying. But he wasn't obviously truthful either. He was just neutral. Maybe too neutral. Like someone who'd prepared for this conversation. Who'd thought about what they'd say if police ever came asking questions again. Or maybe he was just someone who'd been interviewed by police before and knew how to handle it calmly. One more question, Charlotte said. Did you ever approach any young girls in the area? Ask if they needed help or directions. Offer rides. Horvath's jaw tightened slightly. The first real sign of emotion. No, absolutely not. I have daughters myself. I would never do something like that. I'm not accusing you. I'm just asking. Well, the answer is no. I kept to myself. Did my work. Went home to my family. That's it. Charlotte thanked him for his time. Gave him her card. Said she might follow up with more questions. Horvath took the card but didn't look at it. Just set it on his desk. I hope you find out what happened to her, he said. I really do. But you're looking in the wrong direction if you're looking at me. Charlotte left the office, walked back to her rental car, sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. Her instincts were screaming that something about Horvath was wrong. But instincts weren't evidence. Courts didn't convict based on a detective's gut feeling. She needed more. And she didn't have it. Back in Melbourne, Charlotte continued investigating. She pulled traffic camera footage from 2011. Most of it had been reviewed at the time, but she looked again with fresh eyes. Looking specifically for a beige Honda Accord. She found several. Boronia was a suburb. Lots of people drove light-colored sedans. Without license plates visible in the footage, there was no way to identify which specific vehicles belonged to whom. She reviewed Horvath's phone records from June 2011. His company-issued mobile had ping towers throughout Boronia that morning. The data was consistent with someone driving around the area doing service calls. But cell tower data wasn't precise enough to place him at a specific location. It could put him within a few kilometers, not at a specific street corner at a specific time. Charlotte knew she was reaching, building a case on coincidences and vague alignments rather than hard evidence. But sometimes that's how cold cases broke. You follow the thread that feels wrong even when you can't articulate why. You trust that instinct will lead somewhere concrete eventually. Or you waste time chasing shadows while the real perpetrator remains unseen. Charlotte decided to approach it from a different angle. Instead of trying to prove Horvath was guilty, she'd try to definitively rule him out. Eliminate him as a possibility so she could focus elsewhere. She requested DNA samples from evidence collected in 2011. Compared them against any genetic material they might have from Horvath. There was nothing useful. The DNA from the scene was too degraded or too contaminated to be conclusive, and they had no legal basis to compel Horvath to provide a DNA sample when he wasn't formally a suspect. Dead end. She tried to trace his movements in the weeks after Bung's disappearance, looking for changes in behavior, signs of guilt, maybe increased drinking, relationship problems, job performance issues. His employment records showed nothing abnormal. He'd continued working steadily. No disciplinary actions. No unexplained absences. His financial records, what she could access legally, showed no unusual activity. No large cash withdrawals. No sudden purchases that might indicate fleeing or hiding evidence. If Horvath had abducted and killed Bung Siriboon, he'd shown no external signs of it whatsoever. Which was possible. Psychopaths compartmentalize effectively. They commit atrocities and then go home and have dinner with their families without any visible distress. But it was also consistent with innocence. With being exactly what he claimed, a telecommunications worker who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and got swept up in an investigation. Charlotte was stuck. She had suspicions. She had circumstantial connections. She had a vehicle that matched a vague witness description and a work schedule that allowed opportunity. But she had no evidence. Nothing that would justify an arrest. Nothing that would convince a prosecutor to file charges. And without that, Horvath would remain what he'd been for 13 years. One of hundreds of people who'd been interviewed, investigated, and cleared. Maybe wrongly cleared. Maybe the guilty person hiding in plain sight. Or maybe just another innocent man caught in the orbit of an unsolved tragedy. Charlotte didn't know. And that uncertainty was its own form of torture. Charlotte couldn't let it go. This is the curse of being a good detective. The cases that don't resolve cleanly, the ones with unanswered questions and suspicious coincidences, they burrow into your mind. They live there. You wake up thinking about them. You go to sleep running through scenarios. Michael Horvath might be innocent. Probably was innocent, statistically speaking. But the alignment of factors, the vehicle, the location, the opportunity, the vague connection to the attempted approach on Sophie Grimshaw. It all felt too coincidental. Charlotte knew she needed something more concrete. Something that would either definitively clear Horvath or provide enough evidence to pursue him as a serious suspect. She decided to look at the one element she hadn't fully explored, Horvath's personal life in 2011. His employment records painted one picture. But what about his marriage? His home life? Were there stressors that might have pushed someone toward violence? Charlotte contacted Horvath's ex-colleagues from 2011. People he'd worked with at the telecommunications company. Most had moved on to different jobs, different cities. Some didn't remember him well. It had been over a decade. But one former coworker, a man named Dennis Pryor, remembered Horvath clearly. Mike was intense, Pryor said over the phone. Good worker. Got the job done. But he was private. Didn't socialize much with the rest of us. Would show up, do his work, leave. Did he ever mention personal problems? Issues at home? Not to me. But like I said, he kept to himself. We weren't friends. Just worked together. Did you ever see him interact with children? Or teenagers? There was a pause. Charlotte could hear Pryor thinking. Actually, yeah. One time we were working near a school. Not St. Joseph's, somewhere else. And there were kids around during lunch or something. Mike got weird. Weird how? He just stared at them. For a long time. Long enough that I noticed, and it made me uncomfortable. I asked if he was okay, and he kind of snapped out of it. Said he was just thinking about his own kids. But it didn't feel right. Did you report this to anyone? No. I mean, it wasn't illegal to look at kids. And it was just once. Or at least, the only time I noticed. But when Bung Siriboon went missing and police came around interviewing all of us, I thought about mentioning it. I didn't though. Seemed like nothing concrete. Just a weird moment. Charlotte's pulse quickened. This wasn't proof. But it was another data point. Another suggestion that Horvath's interest in children might not have been purely paternal. Mr. Pryor, if I needed you to give a formal statement about this, would you be willing? I guess. But it was 13 years ago. I don't know how reliable my memory is anymore. Understood. I may contact you again. Thank you. After hanging up, Charlotte sat with this new information. A coworker who'd observed Horvath staring at children in an uncomfortable way. It wasn't evidence of a crime, but it suggested something beneath the surface. Something hidden. She needed to talk to Horvath's wife. Or ex-wife, if they'd separated. Someone who'd actually lived with him in 2011. Who might have noticed behavioral changes. Charlotte found that Horvath was still married to the same woman. Her name was Linda Horvath. She worked as a nurse in Brisbane. Charlotte debated how to approach this. If she contacted Linda directly, Horvath would find out. He'd know police were actively investigating him. He might lawyer up, might stop cooperating. But Charlotte needed information more than she needed Horvath's continued cooperation. She called Linda's workplace. Said she needed to speak with her about a police matter. Not an emergency. Just important. Linda called back during her lunch break. She sounded worried. Is this about my husband? Is he in trouble? No, ma'am. I'm following up on an old case from Victoria. Your husband was interviewed as a potential witness years ago. I just have a few questions about that time period. Oh, okay. What do you need to know? In June 2011, do you remember anything unusual about your husband's behavior? Any changes in routine or mood? Linda thought about it. That was so long ago. I don't wait. June 2011? That's when the girl went missing in Boronia, isn't it? The one who was walking to school. Yes. Mike talked about that. He was pretty upset by it. He had daughters. The idea of something like that happening was disturbing to him. Did his behavior change after the disappearance? Change how? Was he more withdrawn? Anxious? Did his sleep patterns change? Anything like that? Another pause. Longer this time. Actually, yes. He had nightmares for a while. Would wake up in the middle of the night. I asked him about it once, and he said he kept thinking about that missing girl. About what might have happened to her. It bothered him for months. Charlotte's mind raced. Nightmares could indicate trauma. Or guilt. Or both. Did he ever tell you what the nightmares were about specifically? No. He didn't like talking about it. Just said they were about bad things happening to children. I assumed it was normal. Being a parent makes you more aware of how vulnerable kids are. Makes you think about worst-case scenarios. Mrs. Horvath, in all the years you've been married, has your husband ever given you cause to worry about his interactions with children? The question hung in the air. Too direct. Too accusatory. But Charlotte needed to know. What are you asking me? Linda's voice had changed. Defensive now. Protective. I'm asking if you've ever had concerns. About Mike being inappropriate with kids? No. Absolutely not. He's a good father. A good man. Whatever you're implying, you're wrong. I'm not implying anything. I think this conversation is over. If you have more questions, you can talk to our lawyer. The line went dead. Charlotte had pushed too hard. Spooked the wife. And now Horvath would definitely know police were looking at him more seriously. Within hours, Charlotte's phone rang. It was Horvath. Detective Charlotte. My wife said you called her asking strange questions about me. His voice was controlled. But there was an edge to it. Anger, barely contained. I'm investigating a missing persons case, Mr. Horvath. Your wife was married to you during the relevant time period. I needed information. Information about what? Whether I'm some kind of predator. Whether I had something to do with that girl's disappearance. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. The questions make it clear. You think I'm involved. Charlotte made a decision. Sometimes you had to show your cards. Push a suspect and see how they react. Mr. Horvath, you owned a vehicle matching witness descriptions from the morning of the abduction. You were working in the exact area where Bung Siriboon disappeared. Your timeline that morning has gaps. And you had nightmares about the case for months afterward. Nightmares because I'm a human being with empathy. Because thinking about a child being abducted is horrifying. Not because I did it. Then help me eliminate you as a possibility. Agree to provide a DNA sample. Let me verify your exact locations that morning. Cooperate fully. I already cooperated in 2011. I told police everything I knew. Which was nothing. I didn't see Bung Siriboon. I didn't take her. I had nothing to do with what happened. So prove it. I don't have to prove anything. I'm innocent. The burden of proof is on you. He was right, of course. Legally, he was completely right. I'm trying to solve a case, Mr. Horvath. A 13-year-old girl has been missing for over a decade. Her family deserves answers. Then find the person who actually did it. Because it wasn't me. He hung up. Charlotte sat in her office, frustrated. She'd shown her hand and gained nothing. Horvath was now defensive and lawyered up. Any chance of getting voluntary cooperation was gone. And without concrete evidence, she couldn't compel anything. She reviewed what she actually had. A vehicle that matched a vague description, along with thousands of other vehicles. Opportunity, along with hundreds of other people who'd been in the area. Nightmares about the case, which could indicate guilt or just normal human distress about a tragedy. A coworker's vague recollection of uncomfortable behavior around children. 13 years old and impossible to verify. It wasn't enough. Not even close. Charlotte had to accept the possibility that she was wrong. That Horvath was just an unlucky man who happened to work in the wrong place at the wrong time. That her instincts were leading her astray. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was close to something. That somewhere in Horvath's story was a crack she hadn't found yet. She decided to approach it differently. Instead of focusing on Horvath, she'd focus on the vehicle. The beige Honda Accord. If that car had been used in the abduction, there might be evidence of it somewhere. Past repairs. Insurance claims. Anything that might indicate the vehicle had been in an incident on June 2, 2011. Charlotte pulled Horvath's insurance records from 2011. He'd had comprehensive coverage on the Accord. No claims filed in June or July of that year. Not surprising. If you'd used your vehicle to abduct someone, you wouldn't file an insurance claim that might draw attention. But Charlotte looked at subsequent years. In August 2012, Horvath had traded in the Accord. Bought a newer vehicle. The trade in itself wasn't suspicious. People replace cars all the time. But the timing interested Charlotte. 14 months after Bung's disappearance. Long enough to not seem immediately connected. But still relatively soon. Charlotte tracked down the dealership where the trade-in had occurred. They still had records, though the actual vehicle had been resold multiple times since then. Currently owned by someone in regional New South Wales. Charlotte contacted the current owner. Explained she was investigating an old case and needed to examine the vehicle. The owner was cooperative but confused. It's just an old Honda. What could it possibly have to do with a missing person? Probably nothing. But I need to check. The owner agreed to bring the vehicle in for examination. Forensic specialists went over it thoroughly. They were looking for biological evidence, blood, hair, DNA, anything that might link the car to Bung Siriboon. The car had been cleaned countless times in the 13 years since the trade-in. New owners. Different uses. Environmental contamination. But modern forensic techniques could find evidence in the smallest crevices. Places that hadn't been thoroughly cleaned. Traces that persisted even after years. The examination took days. The results came back negative. No biological evidence linking the vehicle to Bung. No blood traces. No DNA matches. Charlotte felt the disappointment like a physical weight. Either the vehicle hadn't been involved, or whoever had used it had cleaned it so thoroughly that no evidence remained. Both were possible. She was running out of leads. Running out of ways to pursue Horvath without concrete evidence. Her supervisor called her in for a meeting. I've been reviewing your work on the Siriboon case, he said. You've put in a lot of hours. Followed some interesting threads. But I'm not seeing anything actionable. I think Michael Horvath is involved. I can't prove it yet, but without proof, we can't pursue him. He's retained a lawyer. He's not cooperating. And we don't have grounds to compel cooperation. We need to be realistic about this. So we just give up? No. We keep the case open. We continue to follow credible leads. But we can't harass a citizen based on circumstantial suspicions. You know that. Charlotte knew. She didn't like it, but she knew. I want to keep looking into him. Off the books if necessary. Her supervisor sighed. Off the books means off the clock. On your own time. Not using department resources. You understand? Yes. Emma, I appreciate your dedication. But be careful. Don't let this case consume you. Don't let it become personal. Too late for that, Charlotte thought. But she just nodded. That night, she went home to her small apartment. Made dinner. Tried to watch television. Couldn't focus. Her mind kept returning to Bung. To that Thursday morning in June. To the minutes between 8:55 and 9 o'clock when a girl disappeared from existence. Someone knew what happened in those minutes. Someone had been there. Had seen. Had done. And that person was still out there. Still free. Still carrying the secret. Charlotte pulled out her laptop. Started going through the case files again. Not looking for anything specific. Just reading. Absorbing. Hoping something would jump out. She read witness statements. Police reports. Forensic analyses. Media coverage. And then she found something. Small. Probably meaningless. But it caught her attention. In the media coverage from 2011, there was a photograph of search volunteers. Dozens of community members who'd helped look for Bung in the days after her disappearance. The photo showed them gathered at a park, preparing to search nearby bushland. Charlotte zoomed in on the faces, looking at each person. And there, in the back row, partially obscured by other volunteers, was a face she recognized. Michael Horvath. He'd been a search volunteer. Had joined the community effort to find Bung. This could mean nothing. Lots of people volunteered. It was a natural response to a tragedy in your community. You wanted to help. Or it could mean something darker. Sometimes perpetrators insert themselves into investigations. They volunteer in searches. They follow media coverage obsessively. They want to be close to the case. Want to know what police know. Want to relive what they did. It's not uncommon. It's a recognized behavioral pattern. Charlotte felt her pulse quicken. This was new information. Information that hadn't been in the police files. She checked the volunteer logs from 2011. Horvath had signed up on June 4th, 2 days after Bung disappeared. He'd participated in 3 separate search efforts over the following week. Why would he do that if he'd abducted Bung? Why risk being seen? Risk being remembered? Unless that was precisely the point. Hiding in plain sight. Being publicly helpful while privately guilty. The ultimate disguise. Charlotte made a note to interview other search volunteers from 2011. See if anyone remembered Horvath. How he'd acted. What he'd said. Most of those interviews led nowhere. People didn't remember specific volunteers from 13 years ago. There had been hundreds of people involved. But one woman, Margaret Liu, a retired teacher, remembered someone who matched Horvath's description. There was a man who seemed very focused on specific areas, she said. Like he knew where to look. Or where not to look. He kept directing people away from certain sections. Said they'd already been searched thoroughly. Did you find that strange? At the time, no. I assumed he knew what he was doing. That maybe police had already cleared those areas. But thinking back on it, yeah, it was odd. Like he was steering people. Away from where? There was a section of bushland near a creek. Pretty dense. He was very insistent that we didn't need to search there. That it was too difficult to access, and if the girl was there, she would have been found already. Did anyone search there eventually? I don't know. I lost track after a few days. The searches got bigger and more organized. Professionals took over. Charlotte checked the search records. That section of bushland had been searched. Multiple times. Dogs. Ground teams. Nothing had been found. But what if Horvath had been trying to keep people away from an area because he knew Bung wasn't there? Or worse, what if he'd been planning to move her body there later and wanted to make sure the area was cleared first? It was speculation. Wild speculation. But Charlotte couldn't ignore it. She decided to return to that section of bushland herself. 13 years later, the landscape would have changed. But maybe there was something still there. Something everyone had missed. The bushland near the creek hadn't changed much in 13 years. Trees had grown taller. Undergrowth had thickened. But the basic geography remained the same. Dense Australian bush, the kind that swallows sound and conceals secrets. Charlotte walked through it on a gray afternoon, the sky threatening rain. She'd brought a local officer with her. Protocol dictated you didn't search potentially dangerous areas alone, but she'd asked him to stay near the entrance while she went deeper. She wanted to think, to feel the space, to understand why Horvath, if it had been him, might have directed volunteers away from this particular area. The creek was small, more of a drainage channel really, running through a gully about 20 meters wide. The banks were steep. covered in ferns and fallen branches. The water itself was shallow, maybe ankle deep. Charlotte followed it upstream, her boots slipping on wet rocks, looking for anything unusual. Disturbed ground, man-made objects, any sign that someone had been here with intent. She found nothing obvious, but there were dozens of small depressions in the earth. Animal burrows, probably, or just natural erosion. Hard to tell after so much time. She took photographs anyway, documented locations, made notes. Then she heard something, a sound that didn't belong. Not animal, not wind. Footsteps. Charlotte turned quickly, hand moving instinctively toward her weapon. A man was standing about 10 meters away, watching her. For a split second, her mind supplied an irrational fear. Horvath. He'd followed her. Known she'd come here. But it wasn't Horvath. It was an older man, probably in his 70s, wearing hiking gear, looking as startled as she felt. "Sorry," he said, raising his hands. "Didn't mean to scare you. I heard someone walking around and got curious. Don't get many people out here." Charlotte relaxed slightly, showed her police identification. "Detective Charlotte. I'm investigating an old case." "The missing girl? From 2011. "Yes. Did you know about it?" "Everyone around here knew. Terrible thing. They searched these woods for weeks. Never found anything." "Do you come here often?" "Walk my dog through here most days." "Have for years." "Did you walk here in 2011? During the searches?" The man thought about it. "I did, yeah. Though I stayed away when the professionals were working. Didn't want to interfere." "Did you ever see anything unusual? Before or after the disappearance?" He shook his head slowly. "Nothing that seemed relevant. Police asked me at the time. I told them the same thing." Charlotte was about to thank him and send him on his way when he added something. "There was one thing, but it was probably nothing." "What was it?" "A few weeks after the girl went missing, I found something in the creek. A backpack. It was caught on some branches under the water. I pulled it out, saw it was a school backpack. Thought maybe it belonged to her." Charlotte's heart rate spiked. "What did you do with it?" "Called police immediately. They came and collected it. Examined it. But it turned out it wasn't hers. Belonged to some other kid who'd lost it months earlier. Different school entirely. Just coincidence." "Do you remember exactly where you found it?" "Sure. It was right over there." He pointed to a section of the creek about 15 meters from where they stood. Charlotte walked to the spot. The water flowed slowly over smooth stones. Tree roots hung down from the bank, creating natural snags where debris could catch. "How deep was the water when you found the backpack?" "Same as now, more or less. Creek doesn't change much." "The backpack was completely submerged. I only noticed it because the sun hit it at the right angle, and I saw a flash of color through the water." Charlotte stared at the creek, thinking about currents, about how objects move in water, about how something small and light could travel from one point to another over time. If someone threw something into this creek upstream, where would it end up? The man considered. Depends on how heavy it was. Light things might wash all the way down to the main drainage system. Heavier objects would probably catch on something within a few hundred meters. Charlotte thanked him for his time, took his contact information, then spent the next hour walking upstream along the creek, looking for access points. Places where someone could stand and throw something into the water without being easily seen from the road or nearby properties. She found several. This area was more isolated than she'd realized. There were sections where you could park a vehicle on a service road, walk 20 meters through trees, and be completely hidden from view. Perfect for disposing of evidence. Or a body. But the creek had been searched in 2011. Multiple times. If Bung's body had been here, it would have been found. Unless it hadn't been here in 2011. Unless it had been moved here later. Charlotte pushed the thought away. She was spiraling now, building elaborate theories without evidence. This was how innocent people got wrongly accused. How detectives destroyed their own careers chasing ghosts. She needed to step back, reassess, approach this scientifically rather than emotionally. Back at her office, Charlotte laid out everything she had on Horvath. Evidence suggesting involvement. Owned a vehicle matching witness description. Was working in the area the morning of the abduction. Had gaps in his timeline. Participated in searches, potentially suspicious behavior. Coworker reported uncomfortable staring at children. Had nightmares about the case for months. Evidence suggesting innocence. No criminal record. Cooperated with initial police investigation. Alibis for most of the morning, though not perfectly documented. No physical evidence linking him to the crime. No DNA matches. Stable family life before and after the incident. Passed initial police scrutiny in 2011. Looking at it objectively, the evidence was weak. Circumstantial at best. Nothing that would convince a prosecutor to file charges. Nothing that would survive a defense attorney's challenge. Charlotte knew she was at a crossroads. She could continue pursuing Horvath based on instinct and weak circumstantial connections. Risk harassing an innocent man. Risk damaging her own reputation if she was wrong. Or she could let it go. Accept that sometimes cases don't get solved. That sometimes the guilty go free because the evidence just isn't there. Neither option felt acceptable. She decided to try one more thing. A long shot, but worth attempting. She contacted the Australian Federal Police's cold case unit. Explained the situation. Asked if they had access to any advanced forensic techniques that might extract new information from old evidence. They did. A new DNA analysis method that could potentially find genetic material in samples that had previously yielded nothing useful. The technique was expensive, typically reserved for the most promising cases. But Bung's disappearance had maintained enough public interest that the AFP agreed to attempt it. Samples that had been collected from the area where Bung was last seen, soil, fibers, trace materials, were reanalyzed using the new technique. The process took months. Charlotte tried to be patient. Tried to work on other cases. Tried not to think about Bung every day. She failed. The results came back in early 2025, 14 years after Bung's disappearance. The new analysis had found something. A partial DNA profile extracted from fabric fibers found on Harcourt Road near where Bung was last seen. The profile was incomplete. Only a few genetic markers, but it was something. It didn't match Bung. It didn't match anyone in the family. It was from an unknown male. Charlotte felt hope and frustration simultaneously. Unknown male DNA near a crime scene was significant. But without a suspect to compare it against, it was just more data in a database. She checked it against every known database. Criminal records, missing persons, genealogical databases that had helped solve other cold cases. No matches, which meant the DNA belonged to someone who'd never been arrested. Never had their genetic profile entered into any system. Like Michael Horvath, Charlotte knew she couldn't legally compel Horvath to provide a DNA sample without probable cause. And she didn't have probable cause. Just suspicions. But maybe she could get it another way. Abandoned DNA, genetic material left behind in public places, could be collected and used for comparison without a warrant. If Horvath discarded a coffee cup, a cigarette, anything with his DNA on it in a public place, that was fair game. Charlotte flew back to Queensland. Not in an official capacity. On her own time, using vacation days. She located Horvath's workplace. Watched from a distance. Waited. 2 days of surveillance. Horvath arrived at work each morning, left each evening. Predictable routine. He bought coffee from a shop near his office building. Charlotte watched him finish the coffee. Saw him throw the cup in a public trash bin. After he'd left, she retrieved the cup. Wearing gloves. Following proper evidence collection protocols. Documented everything with photographs and notes. Back in Melbourne, she sent the cup to a private lab. Not an official police facility. This was personal investigation, so she paid out of her own pocket. The DNA profile came back within a week. Charlotte compared it to the partial profile from Harcourt Road. Her hands were shaking as she reviewed the results. No match. The DNA on the cup, Horvath's DNA, didn't match the unknown profile from the crime scene. Charlotte sat in her apartment staring at the report, feeling the last of her theory collapse. Horvath wasn't involved. Or at least, his DNA wasn't at the scene. Which didn't absolutely prove innocence. He could have worn gloves, could have been careful, but it was strong evidence against his involvement. She'd been wrong. Spent months pursuing a man who probably had nothing to do with Bung's disappearance. Wasted time and resources on a dead end. Charlotte felt the weight of failure crushing her. But she also felt something else. A strange, contradictory relief. Because Horvath had a family. Children. If he had been guilty, exposing him would have destroyed them. At least they were spared that. The unknown male DNA from the scene remained unidentified. Whoever had left it behind was still out there. Maybe the perpetrator. Maybe just someone who'd been in the area coincidentally. Without more context, it was impossible to know. Charlotte filed her reports. Closed her unofficial investigation into Horvath. returned to her regular caseload. But Bung's case stayed with her. In quiet moments. In the spaces between other work. She thought about Vanita. About a mother who'd been waiting 14 years for answers. She thought about Pang. About a woman who'd grown up in the shadow of her sister's absence. She thought about all the people whose lives had been permanently altered by those few minutes on a Thursday morning in June 2011. And she thought about the person who'd caused it all. Who'd taken Bung. Who knew exactly what happened, but had never spoken. That person was still out there. Living their life. Maybe feeling guilt. Maybe feeling nothing. Maybe having forgotten entirely. Or maybe thinking about it every day, the secret eating at them, but the fear of consequences keeping them silent. Charlotte hoped it was the latter. Hoped whoever did this was suffering. Because Bung's family certainly was. In Boronia, life continued. The suburb changed slowly, as all places do. New families moved in. Old ones moved away. The children who'd gone to school with Bung were adults now, scattered across the country and the world. St. Joseph's College still stood. The memorial plaque was still there, though fewer people noticed it with each passing year. Vanita was in her 60s now, still living in the same house on Elsie Street, still waiting. The hope she'd carried for years had transformed into something else. Not quite acceptance, not quite resignation, just a permanent ache that had become part of who she was. She didn't talk about Bung as much anymore. Not because she'd forgotten, not because she cared less, but because after 14 years, what was there left to say? The same questions, the same pain, the same absence. Pang visited when she could, brought her own children, Vanita's grandchildren, to meet the grandmother who carried so much sorrow. The children knew about their aunt, the one they'd never met, the one in the photographs around the house, the one whose room was still preserved exactly as she'd left it. It seemed strange to them, keeping a shrine to someone who disappeared before they were born. But they understood it was important to their grandmother. So they were respectful. Quiet. They didn't play loudly when they visited. Fred was gone now. He died in 2023, his heart giving out after decades of stress and grief. He'd never known what happened to his stepdaughter. Had died with that question unanswered. Vanita thought about him often. About whether he'd found peace. Whether death had finally released him from the burden of not knowing. She didn't believe in much anymore. The faith she'd carried from Thailand had been eroded by years of unanswered prayers. But sometimes she allowed herself to imagine that Fred knew now. That wherever he was, the truth had been revealed to him. It was a small comfort. The case remained officially open. It would stay that way indefinitely. No statute of limitations on murder or abduction. Detectives still reviewed it periodically, checked for new leads, applied new technologies as they became available. The partial DNA profile sat in databases, waiting for a match that might come tomorrow or might never come at all. Someone, somewhere, knew what happened to Bung Siriboon. Maybe they'd stayed silent out of fear. Maybe out of loyalty to someone else. Maybe they'd convinced themselves that what they knew wasn't really relevant. That they were mistaken. That their memory was unreliable. Or maybe they knew exactly what they'd seen and had made a conscious choice to protect a monster. Both scenarios existed in cases like this. Sometimes witnesses came forward decades later, finally unburdening themselves of secrets they'd carried too long. Sometimes they took those secrets to their graves. In 2026, 15 years after Bung's disappearance, a journalist wrote a retrospective article. One of those whatever happened to pieces that media outlets publish on significant anniversaries. The article reviewed the case, interviewed Vanita, spoke with the current detective assigned to the investigation. It generated a brief flurry of renewed interest. Social media posts, true crime podcast episodes, amateur investigators proposing theories online. None of it led anywhere new. Within a week, the attention had faded again, moved on to more recent tragedies, more immediate mysteries. This is the cruelty of time. It dulls everything eventually. Even the most shocking disappearances become old news. Historical footnotes. Stories people tell but don't feel. Except for the people who actually lived it. For them, time doesn't heal. It just extends the suffering. On June 2nd each year, Vanita does the same thing. She wakes early, makes breakfast, toast, usually, like Bung had that last morning. Then she walks the route, from the house on Elsie Street to Harcourt Road, along that final stretch where her daughter was last seen. She stands at the spot, 130 meters from the school, 130 meters from safety. She stays there for a few minutes. Not praying exactly. Not hoping anymore, not really. Just remembering. Acknowledging. Being present in the place where everything changed. Then she walks to the school. To the memorial plaque. She touches Bung's name engraved there. I'm still here, she whispers. Every year. The same words. I'm still waiting. And then she goes home. To the house that's too big now. Too empty. Too full of ghosts. She sits in Bung's room sometimes. On the bed that no one sleeps in. Surrounded by things that belong to a 13-year-old girl who never got to become anything else. The piano sits silent in the living room. No one plays it anymore. But Vanita keeps it tuned. Just in case. Just in case Bung comes home. Just in case the door opens and her daughter walks in. Somehow still 13. Somehow unchanged by the 15 years that have passed. It's impossible. Vanita knows it's impossible. But the heart doesn't care about impossibility. It clings to whatever it needs to keep beating. Somewhere, a person wakes up each morning and goes about their day. They might work. They might have a family. They might seem completely normal to everyone who knows them. But they carry knowledge. The truth about what happened on June 2nd, 2011. The truth about where Bung Siriboon is. The truth about what was done to a 13-year-old girl who just wanted to get to school. They carry it in their mind. In their memory. Locked away but always there. Maybe they think about it every day. Maybe they've buried it so deeply that it only surfaces in dreams. In nightmares. Or maybe they don't think about it at all. Maybe they've compartmentalized it so effectively that it might as well have never happened. That Bung might as well have never existed. But she did exist. She was real. She had a name and a family and a future that was stolen. And someone knows what happened to her. Someone knows where she is. Detective Emma Charlotte is still working cold cases. Bung's is one of dozens she monitors. One of many families waiting for answers she can't provide. She thinks about Horvath sometimes. Wonders if she was wrong to suspect him. Wonders if maybe she was right, but just couldn't prove it. She'll never know for certain. That's the thing about cold cases. Uncertainty becomes permanent. You learn to live with not knowing. But sometimes, late at night, Charlotte pulls up the case file. Reads through it again. Looking for what she missed. What everyone missed. Because someone took Bung Siriboon. And that person left traces. They had to. No one commits a crime perfectly. No one disappears someone without making mistakes. The evidence is out there somewhere. The answer exists. It's just hidden. Buried under time and faded memories and layers of normalcy that have grown over it like grass over a grave. But it's there. And someday, maybe, someone will find it. If you know something about what happened to Bung Siriboon, it's not too late. 15 years is a long time to carry a secret. Long enough that the fear that kept you silent might have faded. Long enough that loyalty to someone else might have eroded. Long enough that the weight of knowing might have become unbearable. You can call Crime Stoppers. You can remain anonymous. You don't have to identify yourself. Just tell what you know. Because Vanita is still waiting. Still hoping. Still standing at that spot on Harcourt Road every June 2nd, wondering what happened to her daughter. She deserves to know. Bung deserves to be found. And the person who took her deserves to be held accountable. The truth is out there. Hidden in someone's memory. Someone's conscience. Maybe that someone is reading this. Maybe they're remembering that Thursday morning. Maybe they're finally ready to speak. Or maybe they'll stay silent forever. Take the secret to their grave. Leave Vanita to die without ever knowing what happened to her child. Both outcomes are possible. But only one is just. Bung Siriboon was 13 years old when she disappeared. She loved mathematics and music. She had a gentle personality. She was intelligent and thoughtful and deserved to live a full life. She was walking to school on a Thursday morning in June, 130 meters from safety. And she vanished. 15 years later, she's still missing. Still gone. Still waiting to be found. If someone took Bung Siriboon that morning, and investigators believe someone did, they didn't just steal a child. They stole a daughter. A sister. A future. Every moment Bung should have lived. Every experience she should have had. Every person she should have become. They stole 15 years of a mother's peace. They stole a family's wholeness. They stole a community's sense of safety. And they're still out there. Still free. Still carrying the truth. But the truth has weight. It has gravity. Eventually, it pulls everything toward it. Maybe that pull will bring answers. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe years from now. Maybe after everyone who loved Bung is gone. Or maybe never. That's the reality of unsolved cases. Sometimes evil wins. Sometimes the guilty escape justice. Sometimes families never get closure. Sometimes girls walk to school and never arrive, and no one ever knows why. That's the truth that's hardest to accept. But accepting it doesn't mean giving up. Doesn't mean stopping the search. Doesn't mean Bung's story ends here. Because as long as someone remembers, as long as someone cares, as long as someone keeps asking questions, she's not just gone. She's still here. Still real. Still mattering. Still waiting. And the question remains. What happened to Bung Siriboon? Someone knows. And the truth, however buried, however hidden, however long it takes, the truth is still out there. If this story moved you, if you believe Bung's case deserves to stay in the public consciousness, help us keep her memory alive. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Share this video with someone who cares about unsolved cases, because the more people who know Bung's story, the greater the chance that someone, somewhere, will come forward with information. And drop a comment below. Tell us what you think happened. Share your theories. Tell us where you're watching from. Let's keep the conversation going. Because cases like this get solved when people refuse to forget. When communities refuse to let a missing child become just another statistic. Bung Siriboon deserves justice. Her family deserves answers. And together, by keeping her story alive, maybe, just maybe, we can help bring those answers to light. Thanks for watching. And remember, if you know something, say something. It's never too late to do the right thing. Yindi.